The wind on the high plains that year had teeth. It did not just blow. It bit, chewing at the eaves of the homesteads and stripping the gray bark from the cottonwoods down in the bottoms. It was a January that froze the breath in a man's throat before he could speak. A winter that turned the world into a landscape of iron and chalk. Jonah Kincaid rode the northern fence line with his chin tucked into the collar of his sheepskin coat. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Miller, stepped carefully over the frozen ground, his hooves cracking through the crust of ice that covered the dry grass. Jonah's hands, gloved in thick leather, were stiff on the reins. Even through the leather, his knuckles were cracked and bleeding, the dry cold splitting the skin until it looked like a drought-struck riverbed. He had been out since first light. The cattle were in bad shape. Their ribs showed through their winter coats like the rungs of a ladder, their breath pluming in short, desperate bursts. Jonah watched them with a heavy, calculating eye. He had lost 10 head already this month to the drifts, and the season was far from turning. He was a man built of the same hard material as the land. He was 40 years old, though the sun and the wind had carved lines into his face that made him look older. He had been a widower for 3 years now, since his wife, Sarah, had passed from a fever that burned through the territory. Jonah had grown silent. He did not dislike people, but he found he had little use for the noise they made. In town, men respected him because his word was as solid as currency, but they did not love him. He did not drink at the saloon until he fell over, and he did not bend his knee when the wealthy cattle barons rode through with their demands and their hired guns. He kept to himself, tending his section of the earth, a man seemingly carved from silence. Jonah pulled Miller up as they neared a shallow ravine that cut through the lower pasture. The wind dropped for a moment, leaving a ringing silence in his ears. Something was wrong. A rancher survived by noticing what did not belong. Jonah scanned the ground. To the untrained eye, it was just snow and sagebrush. But Jonah saw the story written in the white dust. There was a line dragged through the powder, wide and uneven, as if something heavy had been pulled or had pulled itself. A branch of sagebrush, tough as wire, was snapped clean off, exposing the pale, green wood inside. He nudged the horse forward, his hand instinctively drifting toward the Winchester in the scabbard under his leg. He saw a flash of color snagged on a mesquite thorn. It was blue calico, a tiny scrap of cloth that fluttered frantically in the returning wind. It was a domestic color, a kitchen color. It had no business being out here in the emptiness. Then he saw the blood. It was faint, just a dark smear where the snow had melted and refrozen, turning pink and then rusty brown. It led down into the wash, where the shadows lay long and purple. Jonah dismounted. He tied Miller to a scrub oak and walked down the slope, his boots crunching loudly. The drag marks ended behind a cluster of granite boulders that offered a pathetic amount of shelter from the wind. She was crumpled there like a discarded doll. The snow had drifted over her legs and waist, burying her half into the earth. She wore a coat that was too thin for autumn, let alone deep winter, and her skirt was torn. Jonah stopped, his breath catching in a way it hadn't in years. She looked dead. Her skin was the color of old milk, blue-tinged around the mouth and nose. Her eyes were open, staring at the gray sky, but they were unfocused, glazed over with the haze of hypothermia. He moved quickly then, dropping to his knees beside her. He stripped off his gloves, needing to feel for heat. When his hand hovered over her face, she did not blink. "Miss," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Can you hear me?" He reached out to touch her shoulder, intending to check for a pulse. The moment his fingers brushed the wool of her coat, she moved. It was a violent, jerking spasm, a body reacting on pure instinct. She scrambled backward, hitting her head against the granite rock, her heels digging uselessly into the snow. She was too weak to stand, too frozen to fight, but the terror in her movement was absolute. Her eyes focused on him, wild and dark. Her lips were split and bleeding. She tried to speak, but her jaw shook so hard the teeth clicked together audibly. "Don't!" she gasped. The sound was small, breathless, carried away instantly by the wind. "Please, that hurts." She held her arm against her chest, curling in on herself. Jonah froze. He held his hands up, palms open, showing her he held no weapon, no whip, no rope. He saw the way she looked at him. It was not just the fear of a stranger. It was the specific, hollowed-out fear of a woman who had learned that a man's touch meant pain. She was not flinching from the cold. She was flinching from him. "I am not going to hurt you," Jonah said. He pitched his voice low, under the sound of the wind. "I am Jonah Kincaid. This is my land. You are freezing to death." She watched him, her chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. She did not lower her guard. "I need to check you," Jonah said. He spoke slowly, telegraphing his intentions. "You have blood on you. I need to see where you are hurt before I move you. Is that all right?" She stared at him, her eyes darting to his heavy boots, then back to his face. She did not say yes, but she stopped trying to push herself through the rock. Jonah moved by inches. "I am going to touch your shoulder now," he said. He reached out. She squeezed her eyes shut and turned her face away, bracing for a blow. When his hand landed gently on her arm, a shudder went through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. He worked quickly, his face grim. He found bruised ribs that he could feel even through her layers. She whimpered when he pressed there. Her knees were scraped raw, the stockings torn away. Her left wrist was swollen to twice its size, purple and angry. But the worst was her shoulder, beneath the torn calico. The fabric was stuck to her skin by a mat of dried blood and pus. It was a cut, long and jagged, and it was badly infected. The heat radiating from it was terrifying against the chill of the air. She flinched at every touch. It was a patterned response. Jonah saw it, and he did not pretend it was nothing. He did not tell her to hush or to be brave. He simply stated what he found. "Your shoulder is bad," he said, "and your wrist is likely broken." He sat back on his heels. "You cannot stay here. You will be dead by sundown." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw a flicker of defeat so profound it made his stomach turn. She looked as if she were weighing the certainty of death in the snow against the probability of what a man would do to her if he took her. "I am going to take you to my horse," Jonah said. "I am going to put my coat on you. I am taking you to my house. There is a stove there. There is food." He stood up and unbuttoned his sheepskin coat. The cold hit him like a hammer blow, punching through his flannel shirt. But he ignored it. He stepped toward her with the heavy coat held open. She did not help him, but she did not fight him. He wrapped the heavy sheepskin around her, engulfing her small frame. When he bent to lift her, he did it carefully, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back, avoiding the ribs. She was terrifyingly light. She felt like a bundle of dry sticks that might snap if he squeezed too hard. He carried her up the slope to Miller. The horse snorted, smelling the copper scent of blood and the sour smell of sickness, but he held steady. Jonah had to mount first, then pull her up in front of him. It was an awkward, difficult maneuver, and she cried out once, a sharp, jagged sound, when her shoulder bumped the saddle horn. "I have got you," Jonah murmured. He settled her across his lap, shielding her body with his own against the wind. He turned Miller toward home. The ride back was a trial. The sky lowered until it felt as if the clouds were scraping the tops of the hills. The light turned flat and gray, dissolving the horizon. Snow began to fall in earnest, thick, wet flakes that plastered against Jonah's face and froze in his beard. He kept the horse at a walk. Any faster would have jarred the woman too much. She drifted in and out of consciousness against his chest. Occasionally she would jerk awake, muttering unintelligible things, begging someone to let her go, before slumping back into the darkness. Jonah felt every shiver that racked her body. He drove his heels into Miller, his mind racing. Who was she? How had she gotten this far out? The nearest town was 20 miles south, a place of cattle yards and rail lines and hard money. It was nearly dark when the ranch buildings emerged from the white haze. The main house was a low, sturdy structure of logs and stone, with a bunkhouse and a barn set slightly apart. Lantern light spilled warm and yellow from the kitchen window. Jonah rode right up to the porch. The door opened before he could shout, and an older man with a white apron tied over his trousers stepped out. It was Dutch, the cook. Behind him stood Caleb, the young ranch hand, wiping his hands on a rag. "Boss?" Dutch called out, peering into the swirling snow. "You look like a snowman." Jonah slid from the saddle, his legs numb, but he kept his grip on the bundle in his arms. He reached up and pulled the woman down. "Open the bunkhouse," Jonah ordered. "The small room. Get a fire going in the stove. Now!" Caleb stepped forward, his eyes widening as he saw the pale face peeking out from Jonah's coat. "Who is that? Is she dead? Do as I say," Jonah snapped. The authority in his voice cut through their confusion. Caleb ran ahead to the bunkhouse. Dutch stood on the porch, his face tightening with suspicion. "Trouble follows a stray woman." "Jonah," Dutch said, his voice low. "We don't need no grief here." "She is hurt," Jonah said, walking past him. "Get water boiling, and clean rags." He carried her into the bunkhouse. There was a small room at the end, separated from the main sleeping quarters by a thin wall. It was used for storage mostly, but there was a narrow cot and a small potbelly stove. Caleb was already shoving kindling into the iron belly of the stove and striking a match. Jonah laid her on the cot, in the lantern light. She looked worse. The bruises on her face were purple blooms against the pallor of her skin. Her breathing was wet and rattling. She woke as Jonah tried to loosen the coat. Her hands flew up, grabbing at the air, grasping for a door handle that wasn't there. No, I won't go back," she screamed. It was a raw, tearing sound. Caleb jumped back, nearly dropping the lantern. "Easy," Jonah said, stepping back to give her space. "You are safe. Look at me. You are safe." She scrambled into the corner of the cot, pressing her back against the rough wood of the wall. She was shaking violently, her eyes darting around the room. Seeing threats in the shadows, Jonah turned to Caleb. "Go to town. Fetch doctor." "Finch. In this weather?" Caleb asked. "Now," Jonah said. "Take the big bay. He can handle the drifts. Tell him it is a matter of life or death. And Caleb, don't stop for a drink. Don't talk to anyone else." Caleb nodded, intimidated by the look in Jonah's eyes, and ducked out into the storm. The hours that followed were a blur of heat and cold. The room warmed up as the stove roared, but the woman could not stop shivering. Jonah sat in a wooden chair by the door, watching her. She fell into a fitful sleep, but she did not rest. She cried out, whimpering words that made Jonah's hands curl into fists on his knees. She begged for mercy. She apologized for things she clearly hadn't done. "I'm sorry, I'll be good. Please," she would whisper. It made Jonah feel a helpless, burning anger. He wondered what kind of man could instill that kind of terror in a human being. It was past midnight when Caleb returned with a doctor. Finch was a man of 60, with a face like a dried apple and a temperament to match. He shook the snow from his coat and looked around the small room with a sneer of distaste. "So," Finch said, setting his black bag on a crate, "this is the emergency. A stray cat you found in the wash." "Just help her," Jonah said. Finch approached the bed. He pulled the blanket back. The woman woke instantly, her body going rigid. She looked at Finch, at his male hands, his stern face, and she stopped breathing. She looked ready to die rather than be touched. "She needs to be examined," Finch said, reaching for her dress. She scrambled back, a low noise of panic vibrating in her throat. "Wait," Jonah said. He stepped between the doctor and the bed. He looked at the woman. Her eyes were fixed on him, wide and pleading. "I'm going to stand right here," Jonah told her. "You can say stop. If you say stop, I will make him stop. Do you understand?" She stared at him. She was testing him, looking for the lie. She had likely been promised safety before, but Jonah stood still, his hands visible, his face open, slowly, barely perceptibly. She nodded. Jonah stepped back but stayed within arm's reach. Finch grunted and began his work. He was not gentle. He prodded the ribs and manipulated the swollen wrist with professional indifference. "Beaten," Finch muttered. beaten bad, half-frozen, malnourished. He pulled the fabric away from her shoulder to look at the infected cut. The smell of rot filled the small space. Finch shook his head. That is nasty. Needs cleaning and stitching, or she will lose the arm. Maybe the life. He looked at Jonah over his spectacles. You know what kind of woman ends up like this. Kincaid, you know the kind of trouble that comes looking for them. Fix the arm, Jonah said, his voice like grinding stones. Finch shrugged. Hold her down. This is going to hurt. I won't hold her down, Jonah said. He knelt by the head of the cot. He looked at the woman. We need to clean the cut. It is poisoned. It will hurt, but it has to be done. She looked at the ceiling, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes and running into her hair. She gripped the blanket with her good hand until her knuckles were white. Go ahead, she whispered. Finch took a bottle of carbolic acid and a rough cloth. When he began to scrub the wound, the woman arched her back off the mattress. A scream tore from her throat, but she bit it back, turning it into a long, agonized sob. Please, she gasped. Please. She looked at Jonah. It was not a flirtation. It was not a manipulation. It was a plea from the bottom of a well. Jonah reached out and took her good hand. He did not squeeze it. He just offered his own as an anchor. She seized his fingers, her grip shockingly strong, her fingernails digging into his skin. Jonah watched the doctor work, his own hands shaking with the effort it took not to shove the man away. He felt her pain as a physical weight in the room. When it was done and the shoulder was bandaged, the woman went limp, fainting from the exhaustion of the pain. Finch packed his bag. She might live, he said, wiping his hands. If the fever doesn't take her, I will leave some laudanum. He put his coat on. You should turn her over to the sheriff in the morning. Kincaid. A woman like that. She belongs to someone. And whoever it is, they have a heavy hand. Jonah paid the man and sent him out into the night without a word of thanks. The next day broke with a sky as clear and hard as a diamond. The wind had died down, leaving the world scoured and bright. Jonah spent the morning doing only the essential chores, his eyes constantly turning toward the bunkhouse. Around noon, he saw it. He was chopping wood near the barn when he caught a movement on the far ridge. A rider was silhouetted against the blue sky. The man was not moving, just sitting there, watching the ranch. Jonah rested his axe on the ground and narrowed his eyes. The distance was great, but the air was clear. He could see the flash of silver on the saddle leather. He knew that pattern. It belonged to the county lawmen. Sheriff Rudd's deputies rode saddles like that. The rider sat there for 10 minutes, a vulture waiting for a carcass, and then turned his horse and disappeared behind the rise. Jonah felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He walked to the bunkhouse. The woman was awake. She was propped up against the wall, drinking a cup of broth that Dutch had left her. She looked better, though her face was still a map of bruises. When Jonah entered, she lowered the cup, her eyes wary. There was a rider on the ridge. Jonah said, the cup rattled against the saucer. She set it down on the crate with a trembling hand. Law? She asked. Jonah nodded. Looked like it. She closed her eyes. I have to go. She tried to swing her legs out of the bed, but her body betrayed her. She swayed and nearly fell. Jonah crossed the room in 2 strides and caught her, easing her back against the pillows. You aren't going anywhere, he said. You can't stand. They will come back, she whispered. They will drag me back. You don't know them. Who are they? Jonah asked. She shook her head, terrified to speak the names. I ran, that's all. I couldn't stay. What is your name? She hesitated. She looked at the door, as if calculating the distance to freedom. No, she said softly. Jonah pulled the wooden chair closer and sat down. The wood creaked. Listen to me, he said. I am not a man of many words. I don't care what you ran from. I don't care what you did. But the snow is deep and the wind is coming back up. If you go out there, you die. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I won't hand you over, he said. Not tonight. Not while you are hurt. She looked at him, searching his face for the trick. She found only the deep lines of his cheeks and the steady, flat gray of his eyes. "You promise?" she asked. Her voice was so small it barely carried across the quiet room. "I promise," Jonah said. The word hung in the air. It was a plain thing, unadorned, but to her, it seemed to land like something holy. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since he found her in the ravine. Her shoulders dropped. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonah stood up. "Rest. I will be outside." He left the room, closing the door softly. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the snow. The temperature was plummeting again. The wind began to rise, roaring against the boards of the bunkhouse, rattling the loose shingles. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a lonely, yipping sound that echoed off the hills. Jonah did not go to the main house. He did not go to his warm bed. He went to the barn and retrieved his Winchester rifle. He pulled a crate next to the bunkhouse door, right outside where she lay sleeping. He sat down, placing the rifle across his knees. He turned up the collar of his coat against the biting cold. He watched the dark line of the ridge where the rider had been. He was not guarding his cattle. He was not guarding his land. For the first time in years, Jonah Kincaid was guarding a human being. The night pressed in, white and unforgiving, but Jonah did not move. February dragged its heels across the high plains, a month of iron-gray skies and wind that stripped the moisture from the very boards of the ranch house. The snow did not leave, it merely hardened, turning into a crust of ice that could slice a horse's fetlock. The routine of the ranch became a test of endurance. There was ice to chop from the troughs, hay to be pitched to shivering cattle, and the constant nagging worry of the flour barrel getting low. Inside the bunkhouse, and later the main house where Jonah insisted she move for warmth, the woman existed in the quiet spaces between chores. She was healing, but the process was slow and jagged. The bruises on her face faded from angry purple to a sickly yellow, and she could walk now without clutching her side, though she still favored her left leg. But her mind was a slower thing to mend. Jonah watched her with a peripheral awareness, noticing the small, telling habits of a hunted creature. She never sat with her back to a door. If a boot heel struck the porch steps too loudly, she would freeze, her hands suspending whatever task they held. Her breath caught in her throat until the door opened and she saw it was only Jonah or Dutch. She counted the exits in every room she entered. Jonah saw her eyes darting to windows, gauging the width of the frames, calculating if a body could squeeze through. She hid food. Jonah found a hardened biscuit wrapped in a napkin under the cushion of the rocking chair. He found a strip of dried beef tucked behind a row of books on the shelf. It was the hoarding of someone who expected the next meal to be revoked as punishment, and she apologized. She apologized for the floor creaking under her feet. She apologized when the wind blew the door shut with a bang. She apologized for existing in a space that took up air and warmth. Jonah tried to navigate her fear by offering her the one thing she clearly did not expect: choices. He did not order her to eat. He set the plate down and walked away. He did not tell her to sit. He left the chair empty and the fire built up. One evening, while the wind howled around the chimney like a trapped spirit, Jonah sat cleaning his bridle. The woman was by the stove, stirring a pot of beans, her movements small and efficient. "I cannot keep calling you miss," Jonah said. The leather creaked in his hands. "It feels like I am talking to a stranger, and you have been here 3 weeks." She stopped stirring. Her shoulders went rigid. She did not turn around. "You can call me whatever you like," she said. Her voice was low, conditioned to agree. Jonah set the bridle down. "No, that is not how it works here. You have a name, or you can choose one, but it is your choice." She turned then, the wooden spoon dripping bean broth onto the hearth. She looked at him, and, for a moment, the mask of terror slipped, revealing a flash of something defiant. She looked at the window, where the night pressed black against the glass. "Lark," she said. "Lark?" Jonah asked. She lifted her chin. It was a slight movement, but it was there, Because they sing, even in the mud, even when it is raining. They just sing. She said it like a dare, as if claiming the name of something free was a challenge to the world that had tried to cage her. Lark, Jonah repeated, testing the weight of it. It suits you. She turned back to the pot, but Jonah saw the way her grip on the spoon tightened. She had named herself. It was a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. However, inside the warm circle of the lamplight was one world. Outside was another. The ranch crew was small. Just Dutch, the old cook, Caleb, the young hand, and a drifter Jonah had hired for the winter months named Pike. Pike was a man of sour disposition and lazy habits, but bodies were scarce in winter, and the work was heavy. Prejudice, Jonah learned, did not need words to spread. It traveled on glances and silences. The men knew a woman was staying in the house. They knew she had arrived, hurt and nameless. The whispers began in the barn and drifted to the corral. They said she was a fallen woman, the kind that brought disease and bad luck. They said Jonah had lost his senses since Sarah died, that he was letting a harlot warm her feet by his fire while honest men froze. It came to a head on a Tuesday morning. The sky was a bruised purple, threatening more snow. Jonah was checking the cinches on Miller in the corral when Lark came out onto the back porch to shake out a rug. Pike was leaning against the fence, chewing tobacco. He saw her, and his eyes narrowed into slits of wet malice. He waited until she looked in his direction. Then he turned his head and spat a stream of brown juice onto the snow. Inches from the bottom step where she stood, it was a deliberate, filthy gesture. Lark froze. She pulled the rug against her chest as if it were a shield, her face draining of blood. She looked at the spit, then at Pike, and in her eyes was the resignation of someone who believed she deserved the insult. Jonah did not shout. He did not run. He walked around the horse, opened the gate, and crossed the yard. His boots crunched loudly in the silence. Pike smirked, shifting his weight. Expecting a reprimand he could shrug off. "Pack your roll," Jonah said. Pike blinked. "What? You heard me?" Jonah said. His voice was level, devoid of heat, which made it more terrifying. "Go to the bunkhouse. Get your things. I will pay you for the week. Then you start walking." Pike straightened up, the smirk vanishing. "You are firing me? In February? It is 20 miles to town. Kincaid. There is a storm coming." "You should have thought of that before you disrespected my guest," Jonah said. Pike laughed. A harsh, cracking sound. "Guest? Is that what we are calling whores now? You are going to freeze a working man for a piece of—" Jonah moved so fast Pike didn't have time to flinch. Jonah gripped the front of Pike's coat and shoved him backward against the rough wood of the fence. The impact shook the rails. Jonah's face was inches from Pike's, and for the first time in years, the darkness that lived inside Jonah was visible in his eyes. "One more word," Jonah whispered, "and you won't be walking anywhere." He let go. Pike stumbled, gasping, looking at Jonah as if he were a mad dog. He scrambled toward the bunkhouse without another sound. Half an hour later, Pike was a small, dark figure trudging down the road, his bedroll slung over his shoulder. Jonah stood on the porch, watching him go. He knew it was reckless. Losing a hand in winter was dangerous. It meant double shifts for him and Caleb. It meant exhaustion. But he felt the presence of Lark in the doorway behind him. He turned. She was watching the road, her face pale. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "He was right. I am trouble." Jonah looked at her. He saw the way she hugged her elbows, trying to make herself smaller. "He wasn't right," Jonah said. "And on this ranch, we don't spit at people. It is a matter of decency." He walked past her into the house, but he heard her let out a long, shaky breath. In the days that followed, Lark began to work. It was not a request. It was a compulsion. She seemed to believe that usefulness was the currency she needed to pay for her life. She took over the mending basket, her fingers flying over torn shirts and unraveled wool socks with a skill that spoke of long, hard practice. She peeled potatoes until her hands were raw. She scrubbed the floorboards until the wood grain stood up. She worked with a desperate, frantic energy, looking over her shoulder as if waiting for someone to tell her it wasn't enough. Jonah watched her one evening as she sat by the fire, sewing a patch onto his spare coat. Her sleeve had ridden up, and in the firelight, he saw the faint yellow-green shadows of fading bruises on her forearm. He saw how she flinched when Caleb came in to add a log to the fire, how her whole body went rigid until the man moved away. "Lark," Jonah said. She jumped, the needle pricking her finger. She put the digit in her mouth, tasting the blood, her eyes wide. "I'm sorry," she said instantly. "I was clumsy." "Stop," Jonah said gently. He leaned forward in his chair. "I am not scolding you. I just wanted to ask you something." She lowered her hand. "Waiting. You jump every time a man comes near you," Jonah said. "I can see it wearing you down. Do you want me to stop looking at you? I can keep my eyes on the floor if it gives you peace." Lark looked at him. The firelight caught the sharp angle of her cheekbone and the hollow of her throat. She studied his face, the weathered lines, the gray eyes that held no deception. "No," she said. She hesitated, then spoke the words as if they were fragile things. "I want you to look like you see me," she said. "Not what you want from me, just me." Jonah nodded slowly. "I can do that," he said. Their intimacy did not begin with a touch or a kiss. It began in the silence of the room where two lonely people learned to exist without hurting each other. It was Jonah teaching her how to hold the heavy tin coffee mug with two hands so the tremors in her fingers wouldn't spill the hot liquid. It was Lark noticing that Jonah's shirt had a split seam on the shoulder and fixing it while he wore it, her breath warm against his arm, her hand steady as she drove the needle through the cloth. For a moment, as she bit the thread to cut it, her forehead rested against his shoulder. Jonah stopped breathing. He could smell the soap she used, a scent of lye and dried lavender. He could feel the heat of her. Then she pulled away, apologizing with her eyes, and the moment passed, leaving a charged silence in its wake. But the ranch could not exist in a vacuum forever. By early March, the flour barrel was empty, and the coffee tin was full of dust. A trip to town was unavoidable. Jonah delayed it as long as he could, but when Dutch scraped the last of the lard from the jar, he knew they had to go. "You are coming with me," Jonah told Lark. Panic flared in her eyes. "I can't. They will see me. You cannot stay here alone." Jonah said, "Pike is out there somewhere, and if the sheriff comes back, I want you where I can see you." He went to the old trunk at the foot of his bed, the one he hadn't opened in 3 years, and pulled out a heavy woolen bonnet and a drab gray shawl. They had belonged to Sarah's mother. "Wear these," he said. "Keep your head down. You are just a cousin from the east, helping out. We will be quick." The wagon ride to town was 10 miles of mud and slush. Lark sat on the bench beside Jonah. The bonnet pulled so far forward it was like a set of blinders. She gripped the seat until her knuckles were white. Jonah drove with a Winchester resting at his feet, his eyes scanning the horizon. The town of Blackwater was not large, but it was loud. It was a hub for the cattle trade, a place of stockyards, saloons, and a few respectable storefronts that tried to ignore the stench of manure and whiskey. As Jonah guided the wagon down the main street, he felt Lark shrink beside him. She was making herself invisible, folding inward. "Stay close," Jonah murmured. They entered the mercantile. It smelled of pickle brine, leather, and dry goods. There were 2 women at the counter, inspecting a bolt of calico. They looked up as Jonah and Lark entered. The silence that fell was immediate and heavy. They stared at Lark. They looked at her plain shawl, her hidden face, and then they looked at Jonah. It was the look of a small town judging a man who lived alone and brought a strange woman into their midst. Jonah ignored them. He moved to the counter, reciting his list to the clerk. 50 pounds of flour, coffee, beans. While the clerk scurried to fill the order, the preacher's wife, a woman with a face like a pinched crust, stepped forward. "Mr. Kincaid," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweetness. "We haven't seen you at service. And who is this? Friend?" Jonah turned. "This is my cousin, Lark. She is helping with the house." The woman's eyes bored into Lark's bonnet. "Helping," she repeated. Well, the church has a fund, you know, for wayward women. If your cousin finds herself in difficulty. It was a trap, a polite way of calling Lark a whore. Lark trembled. Jonah placed a hand on the counter. My cousin is fine, Mrs. Gable. She needs nothing from the fund. He paid in gold coin, the sound ringing loud in the quiet store. He took Lark by the elbow and guided her out, feeling the eyes of the town burning into their backs. Outside, the air felt cleaner, but the danger was sharper. As they loaded the supplies, Jonah looked across the street toward the saloon. Standing on the boardwalk were two men. One was large, wearing a suit that cost more than Jonah's farm, with a gold watch chain gleaming on his vest. That was Silas Harlan, the cattle baron who treated the county like his private pasture. Beside him, laughing at something Harlan had said, was Sheriff Rudd. Rudd was a handsome man in a serpentine way, with a mustache waxed to points and a tin star that caught the weak sunlight. They looked like two kings surveying their kingdom, clean cuffs and dirty power. Jonah froze. He saw Rudd's gaze drift across the street and land on the wagon. The sheriff stopped laughing. He stepped off the boardwalk and walked through the mud toward them. "Jonah, keep loading," he said to Lark. "Don't look up." Rudd approached, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Afternoon, Kincaid," Rudd said. His voice was smooth, a pleasant baritone that masked the rot underneath. "Don't see you in town much." Jonah hoisted a sack of flour. "Busy winter." "Sheriff?" Rudd leaned against the wagon wheel, his eyes trying to peer under Lark's bonnet. "Heard you had some trouble out your way." "Fired a hand. Pike said you went a little wild on him over a woman." Jonah didn't blink. "Pike was lazy and disrespectful. I don't pay men to spit on my porch." Rudd chuckled. "Fair enough. But Pike says you have a guest. Someone who didn't come in by the stagecoach." He looked directly at Lark's bowed head. "My cousin." Jonah lied smoothly, though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "From St. Louis. She is shy." Rudd smiled, but his eyes were cold. "St. Louis. Long way to come for the winter." "Well, you be careful." "Kincaid. We have had reports of a runaway, a thief, dangerous girl. If you see anything like that, you let me know." "I will do that," Jonah said. He climbed onto the wagon seat and snapped the reins. "Get up, Miller." He did not look back, but he could feel Rudd watching them, his gaze like a hook snagged in their skin. The ride back was silent. Lark did not speak until they were miles away. And even then, it was only the sound of her jagged breathing. When they reached the ranch, night had fallen. They unloaded the wagon in the dark. Inside the kitchen, Lark collapsed into a chair. She began to unbutton her boots, her hands shaking so hard she couldn't work the laces. "Let me," Jonah said. He knelt before her. It was a humble, intimate act. He slid the boot off her right foot, then the left. Then he peeled down the wool stocking. He stopped. On the inside of her ankle, just above the bone, was a scar. It was not a cut or a scrape. It was a burn. The skin was puckered and shiny, shaped into a crude symbol, a circle with a line through it. It was a brand, the kind used on cattle. Jonah stared at it, the horror of it rising in his throat. Lark saw him looking. She gasped and yanked her foot back, tucking it under the chair. Her face went gray with shame. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't look at it." Jonah remained kneeling. "Who did that to you?" She began to cry. Not the silent weeping of before, but a hard, breaking sound. "It's a debt mark," she choked out. The truth spilled out of her then, sharp and jagged like broken glass. "I didn't steal anything," she said. "I was in town, passing through. Sheriff Rudd arrested me for vagrancy because I didn't have $5 in my pocket. He said I had to work off the fine. He sold the contract to Harlan." She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking. "It wasn't work. Jonah, it wasn't. Laundry. They have a house behind the saloon. They keep girls there. Debt contracts. If you refuse, they add to the debt. If you run, they add to the debt. If you cry." She pointed to her ankle. Harlan's foreman did it. With a cinch ring heated in the stove, he said it means I belong to the house. Until I pay. But you can never pay. She looked at Jonah, her eyes red and raw. I begged the sheriff. I begged him on my knees. He just smiled. He said I should be grateful for the employment. Jonah listened. He did not ask for the graphic details. He did not make her describe the nights. He listened to the shape of her pain. He absorbed the weight of it. He reached out and took her hand. He did not say it was going to be all right. He did not say he would kill them, though the thought was a red roar in his mind. I hear you, Jonah said. I believe you. Lark's breath hitched. It was the first time anyone had validated her reality. The shame began to crack. Just a hairline fracture, letting in a sliver of light. That night, the air in the house changed. The fear was still there, but beneath it, something else was growing, a desperate, terrifying desire. Jonah was stoking the stove. Lark was standing nearby, drying a dish. The heat from the iron belly of the stove radiated between them. Jonah stood up and found himself close to her. Too close. He could see the pulse beating in her throat. He could see the stray wisp of hair that had escaped her braid. His hand lifted, hovering inches from her face, wanting to tuck the hair back, wanting to touch the skin that had been so brutalized. Lark leaned in. It was a microscopic movement, a magnetic pull. Her eyes drifted to his mouth. Then the memory of the brand, of the men, crashed into her. She flinched back, her eyes going wide with panic. Jonah dropped his hand instantly. I am sorry, he said hoarsely. Lark stared at him, her chest heaving. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and brushed her knuckles against the back of his hand. It was a featherlight touch, terrified and hungry at the same time. Then she pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. I don't know how to be soft, she whispered. Jonah looked at her, his face shadowed. Neither do I. He admitted, after Sarah died. I stopped believing in anything soft. I thought it made a man weak. I let the winter get inside me. Lark, I am ashamed of how hard I have become. It was a confession he had never made to anyone. They stood there, the air between them vibrating with the things they couldn't yet do, when the sound of dogs barking shattered the moment. Jonah turned to the window. 2 riders were coming up the lane, carrying torches. The sheriff's men, Jonah said. His voice shifted from vulnerable to steel in a heartbeat. Lark made a sound of pure terror. The root cellar, Jonah ordered. Go, now! He lifted the trap door in the pantry floor. It smelled of earth and potatoes. Lark looked at the dark hole, then at Jonah. They will find me, she said. Not if you are quiet, Jonah said. Go deep, behind the burlap sacks. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. She scrambled down the ladder. Jonah dropped the heavy wooden door and kicked a rug over it. He grabbed his pipe, shoved it in his mouth, unlit, and walked to the front door just as a heavy fist pounded on the wood. Jonah opened it. 2 deputies stood there, snow swirling around their legs. One was a man Jonah knew vaguely. Vance, evening. Kincaid. Vance said. He didn't smile. Sheriff sent us to check the property. Says there was a report of stolen tax seen this way. At 9 at night? Jonah asked. He leaned against the door frame, blocking their view. Law doesn't sleep, Vance said. Pushing past Jonah into the room, they tore through the house. They opened cupboards, looked under the bed, kicked over a basket of kindling. Jonah stood in the center of the room, his muscles coiled, watching their boots stomp across the floorboards. Every step they took near the pantry made his heart stop. Under the floor, in the dark. Lark pressed her hands over her mouth, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. She could hear the heavy thud of their boots. She could hear the muffled sound of their voices. She squeezed her eyes shut, seeing the branding iron, seeing the sheriff's smile. Find anything? Jonah asked coldly, after Vance had overturned a chair. Vance spat on the floor. Not yet, but the sheriff has a nose for rats. Kincaid, if you are hiding something, he will find it. And when he does, this whole place burns. They left, slamming the door behind them. Jonah waited until the sound of their hooves faded into the night. He locked the door. He moved the rug and lifted the trap door. Lark climbed out, covered in dust, her face streaked with tears. She collapsed against him, and Jonah held her. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling the frantic beat of her heart against his ribs. He looked over the top of her head, out the window at his land. He saw the moonlight on the snow, the fences he had built, the home he had made. It was his whole life, everything he had. He knew then that it wasn't enough to hide her. The sheriff wasn't going to stop. Harlan wasn't going to stop. If he kept her, they would come for him. They would take his land. They might take his life. He looked at the woman in his arms. He felt the warmth of her, the desperate human need of her. He realized that protecting her was going to cost him everything he owned. And as he stood there in the cold kitchen, Jonah Kincaid realized he could not picture turning away. He tightened his arms around her. "We are not going to run," he whispered into her hair. But the look in his eyes was not one of hope. It was the look of a man watching a storm break the levee, knowing the flood was coming, and deciding to stand in the water anyway. March arrived not with flowers, but with mud. The sun finally gathered enough strength to break the back of the long freeze, turning the iron-hard ground into a quagmire of slush and brown water. The roads, previously locked tight by drifts, opened up like wounds. And with the open roads came the riders. The isolation that had protected the ranch during the deep freeze began to dissolve. Men rode by on the way to the mining camps in the north. Supply wagons churned the muck on the county road. And with the movement came the gossip, buzzing louder than the early flies. Sheriff Rudd did not come back to the ranch himself. He was too clever for that. Instead, he let the story ride ahead of him. He posted a notice in the Mercantile and the post office, claiming that a woman matching Lark's description was wanted for grand theft and assault with a deadly weapon. He flipped the world on its head. The woman who had been branded like cattle was now painted as a dangerous predator, a siren who lured men in and robbed them blind. Jonah heard it from Caleb, who had ridden to the edge of town to check the mail. Caleb came back pale, his eyes shifting nervously toward the house where Lark was sweeping the porch. "They say she cut a man in an establishment," Caleb told Jonah, keeping his voice low by the barn. "They say she stole $300 and a gold watch. Sheriff says she is armed and vicious." Jonah spat into the mud. "It is a lie. Caleb, maybe," Caleb said, shifting his weight. "But the town believes it. And they say you are harboring a fugitive. They say you are compromised. Boss?" Jonah watched Lark. She was unaware of the new story, sweeping the slush with a rhythmic, hypnotic motion. But the tension in the air was palpable. That night, the pressure broke her. Lark had evidently overheard Caleb and Dutch whispering near the woodpile. When Jonah came in for supper, the house was silent. The fire was low. Lark's room was empty. Jonah felt a cold spike of adrenaline that had nothing to do with the weather. He went to the back door. Her boots were gone. Her coat, the one he had patched for her, was gone. He ran to the barn. Miller was still in his stall, but the old mare was restless. Lark hadn't taken a horse. She didn't know how to saddle one quickly enough. She was walking. Jonah grabbed a lantern and his rifle. He didn't bother saddling Miller. The mud was too deep and treacherous for a gallop in the dark. He walked. He found her tracks easily. They were small, desperate holes in the slush, leading north, away from town, toward the high passes that were still blocked with snow. She was walking toward death. He caught her 2 miles out. She was struggling through a drift that had survived the thaw, her breath coming in jagged gasps. She fell as he approached, her legs giving out, and she crawled the last few feet. "Lark!" Jonah shouted. She scrambled up, turning to face him, her hands held up as if to ward off a blow. "Go back!" she screamed. Her voice was raw. "Go back, Jonah! They will take your land. They will put you in chains." Jonah reached her and grabbed her arms. She fought him, striking at his chest with weak, frozen fists. "Let me go," she sobbed. "I am a curse. You know I am a curse." Jonah did not let go. He pulled her hard against him. pinning her arms to her sides until the fight drained out of her. She collapsed, her weight dragging on him, her head falling against his chest. "I am not letting you die in a snowbank to save my reputation," Jonah said. His voice was rough, shaking with the exertion. "It is not your reputation," Lark cried, looking up at him, her face streaked with tears and mud. "It is your life. I am useful for cooking and sewing, but I am not worth your life." Jonah shook her then, just once, sharp and sudden. "Listen to me," he growled. He stared into her eyes, the lantern light reflecting in the dark pools of her pupils. "I am not protecting you because you are useful," he said. "I am not protecting you because you mend my shirts or cook my beans. I am protecting you because you are you." The words hung in the cold air, heavier than the wind. Lark stared at him. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked furious. She looked devastated. "Why?" she whispered, the word tearing out of her. "Why would you say that? It makes it impossible to leave." "Because it is the truth," Jonah said. Lark began to cry. It was a silent, terrible fury. Fury at herself for believing him. Fury at a world that made such a simple belief feel like a danger. She slumped against him, and Jonah scooped her up, turning back toward the ranch lights that flickered in the distance like hope. Back in the kitchen, the warmth of the stove was a physical shock. Jonah set her down on the chair and knelt to pull off her soaked boots. Her feet were ice cold, blue-white and fragile. He rubbed them with a rough towel, his hands large and creating friction. Lark watched him. She was trembling, a fine vibration that started in her core and shook her hands. Jonah stood up and put more wood on the fire. When he turned back, she was still watching him, her eyes wide and dark. "Jonah," she said. He stopped. "Yes?" She stood up. She was unsteady, her ribs aching from the fall in the snow. But she stepped toward him. "Can you hold me?" she asked. It was not a demand. It was a terrifying question. Jonah looked at her hands, which were clenched at her sides. He looked at the pulse jumping in her neck. "Yes," he said. He stepped closer, but he did not grab her. He opened his arms and waited. Lark stepped into the space between them. She hesitated for a second, her body remembering pain, before she pressed herself against him. Jonah wrapped his arms around her shoulders, one hand cupping the back of her head. He felt her flinch, a tiny, electric spasm, and then she melted. She buried her face in his flannel shirt and shook. It was a boundary-pushing moment. There was desire there. Yes, the heat of their bodies was undeniable, but beneath it was a profound, terrifying trust. She was giving him the power to hurt her, betting her life that he wouldn't. Jonah held her as if she were made of glass, breathing in the scent of cold air and lavender soap, his own heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against hers. They stood there for a long time, the fire popping in the grate, the world outside forgotten. But the world outside did not forget them. The next morning, the mood at the ranch was brittle. Caleb and Dutch saw the way Jonah poured coffee for Lark, the way his hand lingered near her arm, the softness in his eyes that hadn't been there for years. They did not say anything to Jonah's face, but the judgment was there. To them. Jonah was a strong man made weak by a woman's wiles. To them, Lark was a siren who had bewitched a good rancher. The prejudice of the West was simple and binary. A man was strong until he wasn't. A woman was good until she was ruined. Jonah felt the eyes on him. He knew that hiding was no longer a strategy. It was a slow death. "We cannot just wait for Rudd to come back," Jonah told Lark 2 days later. He was cleaning his rifle at the table. "If we wait, he writes the ending. We need to write our own." "What can we do?" Lark asked. She was mending a tear in her skirt, her fingers steady now. "I need proof," Jonah said. "Rudd says you are a thief. We need to prove he is the criminal. He rode out that afternoon, not to town, but to the fringes. He found the traveling schoolteacher, Miss Albright, at a small homestead near the creek. She was a stern woman with spectacles and a mind like a steel trap." Jonah asked her about the girls who vanished. She looked at him over her tea. "You are the third person to ask me in 5 years, Mr. Kincaid." The other two stopped asking after the sheriff visited them. She told him names: Sarah Jane, Mary, Little Rose. Girls who were arrested for vagrancy or petty crimes and never seen again. "It is a pipeline," she said bitterly. "They are sold. Mr. Kincaid, like cattle." Jonah then rode to the outskirts of Blackwater, to a small shack near the river where the Chinese laborers lived. He found Lynn, a laundress who washed the linens for the saloon and the brothel behind it. She was terrified of him at first, but Jonah spoke softly, offering her a gold coin not for information, but for her time. Lynn told him about the screams she heard through the walls when she delivered the sheets. She told him about the girls who cried for their mothers. But words are wind. Jonah said to Lark that night, "A judge won't hang a sheriff on the word of a laundress and a rancher." Lark put down her sewing. She looked at the fire, her face pale. "There is a book," she said. Jonah looked up. "A book? A ledger," Lark said. "Harlan's foreman, a man named Griggs. He keeps it. He is proud of his numbers. He writes it all down. The names of the girls, the debts assigned to them, the payments from the men who rent them, and the sheriff's cut." She looked at Jonah. "I saw it once. He left it open on the desk when he was drunk. He bragged that it was worth more than the bank." "Where is it?" Jonah asked. "In the house," Lark said. "In the office behind the main parlor. There is a false wall behind the liquor cabinet. He keeps it there, guarded like gold." Jonah stared at her. The ledger was the key. It was the rope that could hang them all. "We have to get it," Jonah said. "I know the house." Lark said, "I can get in." "No," Jonah said immediately. "You are never going back there. You cannot go in." "Jonah," Lark argued, her voice rising, "you are a man. You cannot walk into the back rooms without being seen. I know the hallways. I know the laundry schedule. Lynn delivers the baskets on Thursday afternoons. I can hide in the cart. It is suicide." Jonah said, "It is justice." Lark shot back. They argued until the fire burned down to embers. But they both knew she was right. But before they could finalize the plan, the war came to them. 2 days later, Jonah rode to the edge of town to buy grain, intending to meet the school teacher again to verify a date. He never made it to the meeting. Sheriff Rudd was waiting. He didn't wait in the street. He waited at the bridge, just outside the town limits, where the road narrowed. 4 deputies blocked the way. Jonah pulled Miller up, his hand going to his rifle, but 3 more riders emerged from the brush behind him. He was surrounded. "Get down!" "Kincaid!" Rudd shouted. Jonah sat tall in the saddle. "On what charge?" "Rudd." "Grand larceny." Rudd smiled. 200 head of Silas Harlan's cattle found on your north range, mixed in with your herd. Branding irons altered. It was a lie so bold it was almost impressive. It was the oldest trick in the range war book. "It is a frame," Jonah said calmly. "Get him down," Rudd ordered. They dragged him from the horse. Jonah fought, landing a solid punch on Vance's jaw that cracked bone, but the numbers were against him. A rifle butt slammed into the back of his head, sending him to his knees in the mud. They cuffed his hands behind his back and hauled him up. Jonah was dragged into town behind a horse, stumbling and bloody, paraded down Main Street like a trophy. The townspeople watched from the boardwalks. Men shook their heads. "Always knew he was a loner." The blacksmith muttered, "Loners turn bad. Stealing from Harlan, he is a fool," another said. Jonah held his head up, though blood dripped into his eyes. He scanned the crowd, praying Lark wasn't there. But she was. She had followed him at a distance, sensing the danger. She was hidden in the alleyway between the livery and the feed store, wearing the bonnet. She watched them drag Jonah through the mud. She heard the jeers. She heard a woman say, "He got what he deserved for bringing that filth to his door." Lark pressed her back against the rough wood of the building. Sickness roiled in her stomach. Helplessness was a taste like copper in her mouth. They had taken him because of her. The frame-up was a punishment for his defiance. Jonah was thrown into the county jail. It was a stone block building that smelled of damp straw. unwashed bodies, and despair. Rudd threw him into the back cell and laughed. "You sit there and think about your choices, Kincaid," Rudd said. "Judge arrives in 3 days. You will hang for rustling, and then I will go get your little bird." Jonah lay in the dark, his head throbbing. He was not alone. In the cell opposite him sat a man in a dusty suit, cleaning his spectacles. "Rough welcome," the man said. Jonah sat up, wiping blood from his cheek. "Who are you?" "Marshal Davies," the man said. "You, Territorial Service, just passing through on my way to Santa Fe. Seems your sheriff doesn't like federal eyes watching his town. He arrested me for public intoxication. I haven't had a drink in 10 years. Jonah looked at him. The man was older, sharp-eyed, with the calm demeanor of a man who had seen everything. "He is corrupt," Jonah said. "He runs a trafficking ring with Silas Harlan." Davies put his spectacles back on. "I have heard rumors, but rumors don't stand up in court. Son, especially not in a town owned by the man you are accusing. I need paper. I need evidence. Without it, I am just a drunk in a cell, and you are a cattle thief." Jonah gripped the bars. "There is a ledger." Davies looked up. "Is there now?" Back at the ranch, Lark was pacing the kitchen. The silence of the house was deafening. Jonah was gone. He was in a cage, and it was her fault. She felt the urge to run, to pack her bag and disappear into the vastness of the West. It would be easier. It would be safe. She went to the old storage shed behind the house, looking for a saddlebag. In her haste, she knocked over a box of papers. They spilled across the floor, old letters, yellowed with age. She knelt to gather them. Her eyes caught a name on a legal document. Jonah Kincaid versus the Union Pacific Railroad. She stopped. She read the letter. It was a commendation from a judge, 10 years old. Jonah had testified against a railroad foreman who had beaten a Chinese worker to death. He had stood up when everyone else had stayed silent. He had lost a contract because of it. He had made enemies. Lark sat back on her heels. Jonah had always been this man. He hadn't changed because of her. She had just reminded him of who he was. If he could stand up then, when he had a wife to lose, maybe she could stand up now, when she had nothing left to lose but fear. She stood up. The trembling in her hands stopped. Lark rode the old mare to the outskirts of town under the cover of darkness. She met Miss Albright and Lynn behind the schoolhouse. "The plan is madness," Miss Albright whispered, her hands twisting in her apron. "It is necessary," Lark said. Her voice was steady. "Lynn, is the laundry cart ready?" Lynn nodded, her face set in grim determination. "It is full of sheets. Dirty ones. Smell bad. No one looks close." Lark climbed into the wooden cart. Lynn piled the soiled linens over her. The smell was suffocating. Stale whiskey, sweat, and the distinct, cloying scent of cheap perfume. It smelled like the trauma she had run from. Lark clamped her hand over her mouth to stop from gagging. The ride was a nightmare of bumps and jolts. The cart rattled through the back alley of the saloon. Lark heard the piano music, the laughter of men, the clinking of glass. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cart stopped. "Laundry!" Lynn shouted. The back door opened. A heavy draft of warm air hit the cart. Lark heard the grunt of the bouncer. "Heavy tonight, Lynn?" The man grunted. "Lot of sin this week," Lynn replied flatly. They pushed the cart into the hallway. Lark waited until the heavy door clicked shut. Lynn began to unload the top layer. "Go," she whispered. Lark slid out of the cart. She was in the back hallway of the house. The wallpaper was red velvet, peeling at the corners. The air was thick with smoke. She knew this hallway. She knew the way the floorboards whined. She moved like a ghost. The office was at the end of the hall. She could hear voices in the parlor, men laughing, women's forced giggles. She reached the office door. It was unlocked. Arrogance, she thought. They think they are untouchable. She slipped inside. The room was dark, lit only by the moonlight filtering through the dusty window. She went to the liquor cabinet. She counted the bottles, whiskey, gin, brandy. She pushed the third bottle to the left. A click. The false panel popped open. There it was. The ledger, bound in black leather, heavy with the weight of ruined lives. Lark grabbed it. She shoved it inside her coat. "Well, look who came home," the voice came from the doorway. Lark spun around. Standing there was Madame Rose. She was a mountain of a woman, encased in purple silk, her face painted into a grotesque mask of hospitality. She held a kerosene lamp in one hand and a small pistol in the other. "I knew you would be back." "Birdie," Rose purred. "They always come back." Lark didn't think. She threw a heavy crystal decanter from the desk. It smashed into the lamp. Fire bloomed instantly. Rose screamed, dropping the gun as the oil ignited on her skirt. Lark lunged for the window. She smashed the glass with her elbow. Pain seared up her arm as a shard sliced her palm open. But she didn't stop. She vaulted over the sill, landing in the muddy alley below. She scrambled up, clutching the ledger. Her hand was bleeding freely, dripping red onto the snow. She ran. Behind her, she heard shouting, "Fire! Stop her! Stop that girl!" She ran through the alley, slipping on rotten garbage, the smell of the town. Manure, smoke, blood filled her lungs. She could hear boots pounding on the boardwalks. She reached the jailhouse. It was a block away. She saw the barred window where Jonah was. "Jonah!" she screamed. She reached the window. She saw his face appear, pale and shocked. "Lark?" She shoved the ledger through the bars. It didn't fit flat. She had to jam it. Tearing the cover. "Take it," she gasped. "Give it to the marshal." Jonah grabbed the book. His hands brushed hers, sticky with blood. "You are hurt," he said, his voice cracking. "Run! Jonah! Run!" she screamed. Inside the cell, Jonah turned. He threw the book onto the cot of the sleeping marshal. "Wake up!" Jonah roared. "Read it!" Davies sat up, startled. He saw the book. He opened it. He saw the columns, the names, the payments from Silas Harlan to Sheriff Rudd, the federal stamps. "Holy Mother!" Davies whispered. Outside, the shouts were getting closer. "There she is!" someone yelled. Sheriff Rudd turned the corner, followed by 3 deputies. They saw Lark standing by the jail window, blood dripping from her hand, her chest heaving. "Grab her!" Rudd screamed. "Shoot her if she runs!" Lark backed away, stumbling into the snow. She looked at Jonah through the bars. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying acceptance. Jonah saw Rudd's men close in. He saw them grab her arms, twisting them behind her back. He heard her cry out, a sharp, high sound of pain. "Let her go!" Jonah screamed. He slammed his body into the iron bars. The metal groaned, but it did not give. He was an animal in a trap. He watched them handle her. He saw Vance strike her across the face to silence her. Jonah lost his mind. He roared, a sound of pure, primal fury. He kicked the cell door, threw his shoulder against the stone, tearing his own skin. He was furious at the cage, furious at the law, furious at God. Inside the cell, Marshal Davies stood up. He tucked the ledger into his coat. He walked to the cell door and looked at Jonah. "Stop it, son," Davies said quietly. "You are going to break your shoulder." "They are killing her," Jonah shouted, turning on the marshal. "Do something! You have the book! Do something!" Davies looked at the ledger, then at the window where the torchlight was flickering, casting wild shadows on the cell wall. He weighed the cost. A war with the county. A shootout with a corrupt sheriff. Jonah grabbed the marshal's lapels through the bars. "I killed a man once," Jonah hissed, his eyes wild. 10 years ago, in self-defense, but I never told the law. I will tell them now. I will confess to anything. I will give you a murder to solve if you step out that door and stop them." The unthinkable bargain. Jonah was offering his own freedom, his own life, to force the hand of justice. Davies looked at Jonah's face. He saw a man who had gone beyond fear. "I don't need a confession," Davies said, drawing his revolver. "I have a ledger." Outside, the torchlight gathered. The deputies were dragging Lark away, her feet trailing in the snow, leaving a line of blood that looked black in the night. She wasn't fighting anymore. She was looking at the jail window, trying to catch one last glimpse of him. Rudd was mounting his horse. "Take her to the river," he ordered. "We will say she tried to swim and drowned." Jonah heard the order. He stopped screaming. He went deadly still. "Open the door," Jonah said to the marshal. Davies unlocked the cell. The two men stepped out into the office. Davies kicked the front door open. "Sheriff!" Davies shouted. His voice was a thunderclap. Rudd turned in the saddle. "Who the hell are you?" "U.S. Marshal," Davies said, leveling his Colt Peacemaker. "And you're under arrest for conspiracy and human trafficking." Rudd laughed. "You and what army, old man?" Jonah stepped out onto the porch behind Davies. He had no gun. He had only his cracked hands and a rage that could burn the town down. "Let her go." "Rudd," Jonah said. The deputies hesitated. The torches flickered. Lark lay in the snow where they had dropped her. A small, broken shape bleeding into the white. The wind began to howl again, blowing the snow over her, as if the land itself was trying to bury the evidence. Rudd's hand hovered over his gun. The town watched from the shadows. The fuse was lit. The standoff in front of the jailhouse did not end with a handshake. It ended with the sullen, grinding tension of a drawn gun that is slowly lowered but never holstered. Marshal Davies, a man whose authority came from a piece of paper signed in Washington and the heavy Colt on his hip, made it clear. Jonah and Lark were now federal witnesses. They were effectively property of the territory, and leaving them in Sheriff Rudd's jurisdiction was akin to leaving a lamb in a wolf den to see if they could be friends. "We ride for the county seat tonight," Davies announced, his voice cutting through the wind. It was a decision born of necessity, but executed in chaos. The wagon Davies commandeered was sturdy but comfortless, pulled by two mules that looked as if they had chewed on granite since birth. Jonah sat in the back, his shoulder pressed against the rough wood, with Lark beside him. Two of the marshal's own deputies, men he had telegraphed for weeks ago who had finally arrived on the late stage, rode flank. The journey from Blackwater to the county seat was a distance of 40 miles. But in the raw, thawing violence of the frontier spring, it might as well have been a crossing of the Atlantic. The roads were not roads. They were scars in the earth, churned into a soup of mud and ice by the thaw. The first night was an exercise in misery. The wagon wheels sank to the hubs in the sucking clay. Jonah spent half the night pushing, his boots filled with freezing water, his breath pluming in the dark. Lark sat huddled in the wagon bed under a scratchy wool blanket, clutching the ledger to her chest as if it were a heartbeat she was afraid would stop. When they crossed the Powder River, the water was high and angry, swollen with snowmelt. The mules panicked in the current. The wagon lurched violently, tipping dangerously to the left. "Lark!" Jonah shouted, lunging for her. She didn't scream. She went rigid, her eyes wide and fixed on the black, rushing water. It wasn't just the fear of drowning. It was the loss of control. It was the sensation of being swept away by forces larger than herself, a feeling she knew too well. Jonah grabbed her arm, hauling her back to the center of the bench just as the wheels found purchase on the riverbed stones. He held her there, his arm an iron bar across her chest, until they were up the muddy bank and on solid ground. She was shaking, a vibration so fine and rapid it felt like a hum against his side. "We are out," Jonah said, his voice low in her ear. "We are on the ground." She nodded, but her eyes were distant, staring at things he couldn't see. Later that night, they camped in a grove of aspen. The marshal's men started a fire, but the damp wood only hissed and smoked. One of the deputies, a man named Miller, was checking the shackles on a prisoner they had picked up along the way. A horse thief unrelated to their trouble, but baggage nonetheless. The sound of the chains clinking, metal on metal, tore through the quiet. Lark flinched. It was a violent, full-body spasm. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands flying to her ears. In her mind, she wasn't in an aspen grove. She was back in the room behind the saloon. She was hearing the belt buckle. She was hearing the lock turn. "Stop it!" she gasped, the words strangled. Jonah moved instantly. He didn't touch her. He knew better than to grab a startled animal. He sat down directly in front of her, blocking her view of the men and the fire. He made himself a wall between her and the world. "Lark," Jonah said, "look at my coat. Look at the button. The top one. It is missing the thread. Do you see it?" She breathed in jagged hitches, her eyes flying open, wild and unseeing. "Look at the button," Jonah commanded softly. "Tell me what color the thread is." It is black," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It is navy blue," Jonah corrected gently. "Look closer." She focused. She forced her mind to narrow down, to leave the memory and land on the small, tangible reality of Jonah's coat. The panic began to recede, leaving her hollow and ashamed. She slumped forward, hiding her face in her hands. "I am sorry," she choked out. "I am so sorry. I am broken. Jonah, I am just broken glass in a sack." Jonah reached out and took her wrists, pulling her hands away from her face. "You are not broken," he said. "You are hurt. There is a difference. A broken tool is useless. You are still working." He didn't let go of her wrists. He held them until her pulse slowed, his thumbs rubbing circles over the prominent bones. The second night, the weather turned from wet to bitter. The temperature dropped, freezing the mud into ruts that jarred the teeth. They reached a way station, a tiny cabin abandoned by trappers years ago, with a roof that sagged and a door that hung on leather hinges. It was too small for everyone. Davies and his men took the lean-to outside with the prisoner, giving Jonah and Lark the interior, not out of kindness, but out of a pragmatic need to keep the witnesses alive. There was no furniture, only a dirt floor and a stone hearth. Jonah built a fire with the dry wood he had kept wrapped in oilcloth. The heat was meager, battling the drafts that whistled through the chinking. "We have to share the heat," Jonah said. He was spreading the blankets on the floor near the hearth. Lark stood by the door, hugging herself. She looked at the makeshift bed, then at Jonah. The intimacy of it, the forced proximity, was terrifying. But the cold was a physical pain, gnawing at her bones. "All right," she whispered. They lay down fully clothed, Jonah on the outside nearest the door, Lark against the wall. He draped his heavy sheepskin coat over both of them. For an hour, they lay in silence, listening to the wind and the breathing of the men outside. But the cold was insidious. Jonah could feel Lark shivering, her body curled into a tight ball, not touching him. "Lark," Jonah whispered into the dark, "you are freezing." "I am fine," she lied, her teeth chattering. "You are not," Jonah said. "Come here." He didn't grab her. He lay on his back and opened his arm, creating a space against his side. She hesitated. She was fighting a war inside herself, the instinct to survive against the instinct to flee. Slowly, inch by inch, she uncurled. She scooted backward until her back pressed against his side. Jonah lowered his arm, resting it heavily over her waist. It was a claim, but it was also a shield. He felt her stiffen, waiting for the hand to roam, for the demand to follow. When he simply held her, motionless, she let out a long, ragged breath. "Is this all right?" Jonah asked. "Yes," she whispered. He pulled her closer, tucking her head under his chin. The warmth generated between them was sudden and intense. It was more than body heat. It was the friction of two lonely lives finally touching. In the dark, the constraints of their world fell away. There was no sheriff, no cattle baron, no judge. There was only the smell of wood smoke, old wool, and each other. "Jonah," Lark said softly. Her hand moved, gripping the sleeve of his shirt as if it were a lifeline. "Yes, do you think a person can ever be clean again?" Jonah tightened his hold on her. "Clean? Lark, you are not dirty. Dirt washes off. What they did to you. That is not dirt. That is a wound. It feels like dirt," she confessed. "It feels like I carry it under my skin." Jonah shifted, turning on his side so he was facing her back. He pressed his forehead against her shoulder blade. "If you are dirty, then I am filthy," Jonah said. "I have killed men. I have hated. I have turned my back on people who needed help because I was too busy mourning my own loss. We are all covered in dust. Lark, the only thing that matters is what we do when we stand up." She turned in his arms then, shifting until she was facing him. The firelight was dying, casting a dull red glow on her face. Her eyes were searching his, looking for the lie, looking for the pity. She found neither. She found a hunger that mirrored her own. Jonah lifted his hand. He moved slowly, giving her time to pull away. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, his skin rough against her softness. "Can I kiss you?" he asked. The question hung in the air, radical in its respect. Lark looked at his mouth. She felt a surge of panic, followed immediately by a wave of wanting so strong it made her dizzy. She didn't want to be taken. She wanted to give. Yes, she breathed. He leaned in. It wasn't a tentative peck. When his mouth touched hers, it was with the weight of months of silence. He kissed her with a desperate, suppressed intensity, tasting of coffee and grief. Lark froze for a second, her body bracing for the violence it knew. But there was no violence. There was only Jonah's hand cradling her head, keeping her safe, in the heat of his mouth. She made a sound, a small, broken whimper, and kissed him back. She opened to him, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. It was a collision of needs. It was hunger and grief tangled together until they couldn't be separated. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air, Lark buried her face in his neck. Jonah felt wetness against his skin. She was crying. "Did I hurt you?" Jonah asked, pulling back instantly, panic in his voice. "No," Lark sobbed. "No, it felt good. And that scares me." She looked at him, her eyes shining with tears. "If it feels good, does that mean I am what they say I am? Does it mean I am wicked?" Jonah gripped her shoulders. "No, it means you are alive. It means they didn't kill the part of you that knows how to love. That is not wicked. Lark, that is a miracle." He wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. "I want you." "Lark," Jonah said. He said it plainly, without shame. "I want you in my bed. I want you in my life. But I can wait. I can wait until the fear is gone. I can wait 10 years if that is what it takes. But I won't lie to you and say I don't feel it." Lark looked at him, at the honesty etched into his face. "I hate my body sometimes," she whispered, confessing the darkest thing she carried. "I hate it for surviving. I hate it for responding. Sometimes I wanted to just stop, to go to sleep and not wake up. But my body kept breathing. It kept healing. I felt like a traitor to my own soul." Jonah pulled her against him, holding her so tight it crushed the breath from her lungs. "Survival isn't sin," he murmured into her hair. "Staying alive is the hardest work there is. You didn't betray yourself. You carried yourself through the fire so you could be here. With me. Tonight, they fell asleep like that, tangled together, not having sex, but sharing an intimacy that was far more dangerous. They slept holding on to the promise that they were real, and that they mattered." The arrival at the county seat 2 days later was a jarring return to civilization. The town of Silverton was larger than Blackwater, built on mining money and ambition. The buildings were brick, the streets were cobbled, and the people wore clothes that had never seen a branding iron. But prejudice here wore a better suit. Marshal Davies brought them to the courthouse, a grand building with white pillars that looked like teeth. They were met by a clerk who looked down his nose at Jonah's mud-spattered coat and Lark's plain, gray shawl. "The witnesses," Davies announced. The clerk sniffed. "The woman is to be held in the detention wing? She is a witness, not a criminal," Davies snapped. "She stays in the hotel under guard," but the eyes followed them. In the hotel lobby, well-dressed women pulled their skirts aside as Lark passed. They whispered behind gloved hands. They didn't see a victim. They saw a stain. They saw a woman who had been in a brothel, and to their minds, the reason didn't matter. The fact was enough to condemn her. And they looked at Jonah with pitying contempt, the rancher who lost his wits. The fool who fell for a fallen woman and dragged his name through the mud for her. Silas Harlan arrived the next morning. He didn't come in a wagon. He came in a private coach, surrounded by 3 lawyers in black suits who looked like crows. Harlan was a man who occupied space with aggressive confidence. He walked into the hotel dining room where Jonah and Lark were eating breakfast under the watchful eye of a deputy. "Jonah Kincaid," Harlan boomed, his voice rich and jovial. "A tragedy. Truly. To see a good man ruined by appetites." Jonah stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. Lark grabbed his wrist, her fingers digging in. "You are a long way from your bought and paid for sheriff." "Harlan," Jonah said. Harlan smiled, showing gold teeth. "The law is the law, Jonah, and the law says you kidnapped this poor, mentally disturbed woman to cover your theft of my cattle. We are just here to help her, to get her the care she needs in a proper asylum." Lark went pale. An asylum. That was their new angle. Not prison, but a madhouse. A place where she could be silenced forever under the guise of medicine. "I am not mad," Lark said. Her voice was shaking, but she spoke. Harlan didn't even look at her. He looked only at Jonah. "See? Delusional. A sad case." He walked away, his lawyers trailing him, leaving a scent of expensive tobacco and impending doom. The hearing was set for the following day. That afternoon, Jonah and Lark were summoned to the marshal's office to review the ledger. The walk was only 3 blocks, but in Silverton, 3 blocks was a gauntlet. Rudd hadn't given up. He just hadn't shown his face. They were passing a narrow alleyway between the bank and the assay office when the first shot cracked. It didn't sound like a gun. It sounded like a whip crack in the cold air. A puff of brick dust exploded from the wall, inches from Lark's head. "Down!" Jonah screamed. He didn't think. He moved. He threw his body over Lark, driving her into the dirt of the street. A second shot rang out. Jonah jerked. A grunt of pain was punched out of him. The street erupted into chaos. Horses screamed and reared. Pedestrians scattered like quail. Marshal Davies and his deputies drew their weapons, firing blindly into the alley where the smoke had appeared. "Get them inside," Davies roared. They scrambled into the bank lobby, crawling on hands and knees. "Jonah!" Lark gasped. Jonah was sitting against the teller's counter, clutching his left arm. Blood was welling up between his fingers, dark and fast. The bullet had grazed the bicep, tearing a deep furrow through the muscle. "I am fine," Jonah gritted out, his face gray. "Just a scratch." "It is not a scratch," Lark cried. For the first time since he found her in the snow, the roles reversed. Jonah was the one sliding down the wall. His strength failing, Lark was the one who had to act. She didn't freeze. The sight of his blood didn't paralyze her, it galvanized her. She ripped the hem of her petticoat, the sound of tearing fabric loud in the hushed bank. "Move your hand," she ordered. Jonah looked at her. Her face was fierce, her eyes dry and focused. He moved his hand. Lark pressed the cloth into the wound. Jonah hissed in pain, his head falling back. "Hold still," she whispered. It was a prayer and a command. "Hold still. Jonah, I have got you." Her hands, which had trembled for weeks over a cup of tea, were steady now. She bound the wound tight, using the leverage of her own body to apply pressure. She wiped the sweat from his forehead with her sleeve. "You saved me," she said, her voice trembling now that the work was done. "You stepped in front of it. I would do it again," Jonah whispered, closing his eyes. Back in the hotel room, with the doctor summoned by the marshal tending to the stitches, the reality of their situation set in. They weren't just fighting for reputation, they were fighting for survival. The next morning, the preliminary hearing began. The courtroom was packed. The air smelled of wet wool and unwashed bodies. Judge Thaddeus Moore sat on the bench, a man with a face like a hatchet and little patience for drama. Harlan's lawyer, a man named Sterling, began by painting Lark as a hysteric, a woman of loose morals who had seduced a lonely rancher and led him into a life of crime. "She claims she was held against her will," Sterling said, pacing before the bench. "Yet she had ample opportunity to leave. She claims abuse, yet she has no witnesses but a disgruntled rancher who is himself accused of theft. This is a fantasy, Your Honor, a fantasy conjured by a woman desperate to avoid the consequences of her vagrancy. Lark sat in the witness chair. She felt small. She felt the eyes of the room on her skin like insects. Judge Moore looked at her over his spectacles. Miss Doyle, did you or did you not work in the establishment known as the Gilded Lily? I was forced to work there, Lark said quietly. Forced? The judge raised an eyebrow. Did they chain you to the bed? Laughter rippled through the courtroom. It was a cruel, casual sound. Lark looked at the judge. She looked at Harlan, smirking in the front row. She looked at Jonah, sitting at the defense table with his arm in a sling, his face pale, but his eyes locked on hers. She found something in his gaze. She found the reflection of the woman he saw. No, Lark said. Her voice was louder this time. They didn't chain me to the bed. They chained me to a debt I could never pay. They burned my ankles so I would know I was property. She stood up. The room went quiet. You ask if I am a loose woman, Lark said, her voice ringing off the rafters. I am a woman who survived hell. And you, sir, she pointed at the lawyer, you are trying to send me back there because it is easier than believing a wealthy man is a monster. Sit down, the judge barked. I will not sit down, Lark shouted. She was trembling, but it was the trembling of a bowstring drawn tight. I have apologized for breathing for 6 months. I have apologized for bleeding when they hit me. I will not apologize for speaking the truth in a house of law. Jonah watched her, and his heart swelled until it hurt. She was magnificent. She was terrified, but she was standing. The hearing ended in a stalemate. The judge, annoyed by the outburst but shaken by the specificity of her accusation, ordered a full trial to commence in 3 days. That night, in the hotel room, the mood was heavy. Marshal Davies paced the floor. You made a splash, Miss Doyle, Davies said, but a splash isn't a verdict. The jury will be men who do business with Harlan, men who drink with Rudd. Trials don't guarantee justice. Sometimes they just create a public stage to destroy a woman. He stopped and looked at them. I can get you out, Davies said quietly. Tonight, I can put you on a train to Oregon. You can disappear. Change your names. Start over. If you stay, they will tear you apart. They will bring up every detail of those months in the brothel. They will shame you until you wish you were dead. Jonah looked at Lark. He saw the fatigue in her face. He saw the fear that never really left. Oregon, Jonah said, it sounds safe. There is rain there, green grass. He wanted it. He wanted to take her and run, to hide her in a cabin where no one knew her name, to be safe. Lark walked to the window. She looked out at the dark street where the assassin had waited. If we run, she said softly, does Rudd stay sheriff? Davies sighed. Likely. Without your testimony, the ledger is just numbers. We need the witness to tie the payments to the coercion. And the girls? Lark asked. The ones in the cellar? They stay, Davies admitted. Lark turned around. She looked at Jonah. She looked at his bandaged arm. I want to go, she said. I want to run so bad my legs ache with it. She walked over to Jonah and took his good hand. But if we run, Lark said, we leave the door open for them to eat the next girl. And the next. Jonah squeezed her hand. It is the harder road. Lark, it might break us. It might, she agreed. But I refuse to vanish again. I spent a year being a ghost. I want to be real, even if it hurts. Jonah nodded. He lifted her hand and kissed the knuckles. Then we fight, he said. The next morning, the glimmer of hope arrived. It didn't come with a fanfare. It came with a nervous knock on the door. Marshal Davies opened it to find a young man standing there, twisting his hat in his hands. It was one of Rudd's junior deputies, a boy named Thomas, who looked barely 18. I heard what she said in court, Thomas stammered. About the burning. He looked at Lark, then at the floor. I was there, Thomas whispered. I held the lantern. I didn't want to. But the sheriff, he said it was the law. Davies grabbed the boy by the shoulder and pulled him into the room. You are willing to swear to that? On a Bible? Thomas nodded, tears in his eyes. I can't sleep. Marshal, I see her face every time I close my eyes. Davies looked at Jonah and Lark. A grim smile touched his lips. "Well," Davies said, "it seems the dam is cracking." For the first time, the monolithic power of Sheriff Rudd and Silas Harlan looked uncertain. A deputy had broken ranks. The silence was ending. But as Jonah looked out the window at the busy street, he didn't feel relief. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He knew men like Rudd. He knew men like Harlan. When a predator is cornered, it doesn't surrender. It attacks. The danger wasn't over. It was just changing shape. Desperate men were about to do desperate things, and the trial hadn't even begun. The spring thaw arrived like a fever breaking, leaving the town of Silverton sweating under a pale, watery sun. The streets were not just muddy. They were a slurry of horse manure, melting ice and the dark, rich earth of the high plains churning under the wheels of wagons. The air smelled of wet wool, cheap tobacco, and the copper tang of old blood that seemed to seep up from the floorboards of the county courthouse. The courtroom itself was a cavernous hall of oak and dust, packed to the rafters. Every bench was filled. Men stood along the back walls, their hats in their hands, their eyes bright with the anticipation of a spectacle. Women, who usually avoided the rougher machinery of the law, sat in the middle rows, their bonnets pulled tight, whispering behind gloved hands. They were there to see the fallen woman. They were there to see the rancher who had thrown his life away for her. Lark sat at the small defense table. She wore the gray dress Jonah had bought her, the collar buttoned to her chin. She felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes pressing against her skin. It was a physical sensation, a heavy, suffocating blanket of judgment. She wanted to shrink. She wanted to fold herself into a shape so small that she could slip through the cracks in the floor and disappear into the dark earth below. But then she felt a boot nudge the leg of her chair. She didn't turn around, but she knew who it was. Jonah was sitting directly behind her, just outside the bar. He was not touching her with his hands. The bailiff had forbidden it, but his presence was a wall of heat at her back. He was silent, steady, a fixed point in a spinning world. His proximity told her, "I am here. You are real." It was not a romantic intimacy. It was the intimacy of two soldiers sharing a foxhole while the shelling started. Lark forced her shoulders back. She lifted her chin. She would not give them her collapse. The trial began with the tedious scratching of the stenographer's pen and the booming voice of the prosecutor. A man named Garrett, who seemed determined to do his job despite the political pressure. But the real theater began when Silas Harlan's lawyer, Sterling, stood up to cross-examine Lark. Sterling was a man who used words like bludgeons. He paced in front of the witness box, smiling a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Doyle," Sterling began, his voice smooth as oil, "you claim you were held against your will, yet we have statements here saying you accepted meals, you accepted clothing, you accepted a room, I accepted survival." Lark said. Her voice was thin, but it carried survival. Sterling scoffed. "Or was it simply that the trade suited you until the work became too hard?" "Objection!" Garrett shouted. "Sustained," Judge Moore muttered, though he looked bored. "Watch your tone, Mr. Sterling." Sterling pivoted. "Let us talk about your character, Miss Doyle. You arrived in town with no money. You were arrested for vagrancy. You have no husband, no family, and now you are living in the home of a widower, alone, miles from civilization." He leaned on the railing, bringing his face close to hers. "Are we to believe that your relationship with Mr. Kincaid is purely charitable? Or is it possible that you are a woman of natural temptations, who found a new patron when the old one tired of her?" The words hit Lark like slaps. Liar, thief, temptress. They were the names men had always given her to justify their own sins. The courtroom buzzed. A woman in the second row laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. Lark looked at the judge. He was cleaning his spectacles. He was letting it happen because, in this territory, prejudice was the default law. A woman without a man was a problem. A woman with the wrong man was a scandal. Lark gripped the arms of the chair until her knuckles turned white. "I am not a temptress," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. I am a woman who was branded with a hot iron because I refused a man. Sterling waved his hand dismissively. A burn you likely inflicted yourself to garner sympathy. No more questions. Lark stepped down, her legs shaking. As she passed Jonah, his hand twitched on his knee, a restrained impulse to reach out. She caught his eye. His gaze was dark, furious, and fiercely proud. Next witness, the bailiff called. Jonah Kincaid. Jonah stood up. He walked to the stand with the heavy, rolling gait of a man who spent his life in the saddle. His left arm was still in a sling from the bullet wound, a stark reminder of the violence that had brought them here. He sat down, the wood creaking under his weight. Garrett, the prosecutor, walked him through the timeline. The discovery in the snow, the injuries, the threats from the sheriff. But it was Sterling's turn again, and he rose with the eagerness of a wolf sighting a limping calf. Mr. Kincaid, Sterling said, you admitted to lying to Deputy Vance when he searched your home. Is that correct? It is, Jonah said. His voice was a low rumble, filling the room. So you are a liar, Sterling said. I lied to save a life, Jonah said. You lied to the law, Sterling corrected. And you are harboring a fugitive. Tell me, Mr. Kincaid, why should this jury believe a single word you say? You are a lonely man. You are clearly infatuated with this woman. You would say anything, do anything, to keep her in your bed. The insinuation hung in the air, thick and ugly. The townspeople leaned forward. This was the narrative they understood. The weak man, the wicked woman. Jonah looked at the jury. He looked at the 12 men, ranchers, shopkeepers, miners, who were watching him with skepticism. He knew he had to break the narrative. He had to do the unthinkable. He reached into his coat pocket with his good hand. I am not a saint, Jonah said. He pulled out a folded packet of papers. And I am not a man who lies easily. To prove that, I am submitting this into evidence. He held the papers out to the stunned clerk. What is this? Judge Moore asked. Leaning forward, it is a sworn statement, Jonah said, along with letters from my late wife, 10 years ago, in the Wyoming Territory. I killed a man named Ellis Thorne. The courtroom gasped. The sound sucked the air out of the room. It was never solved. Jonah continued, his voice steady. He drew on me in a dispute over water rights. I shot him. I buried him. I never told the law because I didn't think I would get a fair hearing against his family. He looked at Sterling. I am confessing to a killing. Sir, I am handing you my freedom. If I am willing to go to prison for a crime I hid for a decade. Do you think I would lie about a ledger I found last week? Sterling stood frozen. His mouth opened, but no words came. Jonah had taken the weapon of character assassination and broken it over his own knee. He had destroyed his own reputation to save his credibility. I am not a saint, Jonah repeated, looking at Lark. I am just a man who knows the difference between a sin and a crime, and what was done to this woman was a crime. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the judge looked stunned. Jonah Kincaid had just gambled his life to prove he was telling the truth. The momentum shifted. The prosecutor, seizing the opening Jonah had carved out of his own flesh, brought out the ledger. He called Marshal Davies to the stand. Davies, grim and professional, walked the jury through the columns. Here, Davies said, pointing to a page blown up on a chart. March 12th, $50. The initials S.R., that is Sheriff Rudd. And here, the corresponding entry in the intake log for the brothel. Girl, unclaimed, debt assigned. The prosecutor traced the lines. Signatures matched. Dates matched. The pattern was undeniable. It wasn't just a brothel, it was a machine that turned vagrancy laws into slavery. But numbers were cold. The jury needed to feel the heat. The prosecutor called Lynn. The Chinese laundress walked to the stand. She was small, wearing a high-collared tunic, her hands hidden in her sleeves. The crowd murmured. To them. She was invisible, a fixture of the town's background, like a lamppost or a hitching rail. Sterling tried to object. Your Honor, this witness does not speak English. She is a foreigner who— I speak English, Lynn said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through Sterling's bluster like a razor. "I was born in San Francisco." She sat down. She looked at Silas Harlan, who was staring at her with cold, reptilian eyes. She looked at Sheriff Rudd, who was sitting at the defense table, his face red with fury. Her hands shook, but she did not look away. "Tell us what you saw." Lynn, the prosecutor, said. "I saw the girls. Lynn said, I brought the sheets. Mondays and Thursdays. I saw them crying. I saw the bruises. Did you see Miss Doyle?" "Yes." Lynn pointed a trembling finger at Lark. "I saw her. I saw the foreman, Griggs. Take the hot iron from the stove. I heard him say, 'This will keep you from running.' I heard her scream. It sounded like an animal dying." The courtroom tried to dismiss her. Men muttered racial slurs. Women shook their heads. But the details were too specific. The smell of the burning skin. The color of the iron. The specific threats Griggs used. Truth has a texture that lies cannot mimic, and Lynn's testimony was rough with it. Then came Miss Albright, the schoolteacher. She was a woman of unimpeachable reputation, a pillar of the church. When she took the stand, the murmuring stopped. She opened a notebook. Sarah Jane Miller. Miss Albright read, "Arrested June 4th, 1884. Never seen again. Mary Lewis, arrested September 1st. Vanished." She looked up at the gallery. "I asked Sheriff Rudd about these girls. She said, he told me they moved on. He told me they were trash. But Mary Lewis was my student. She had a lisp. She loved to read. She wasn't trash. She was a child." In the back of the room, a woman began to cry. It was a soft, stifled sob, but it grew. Then another woman joined her. Mothers, aunts, women who had been told their daughters and nieces had run away to live in sin were suddenly realizing the pattern touched their own homes. The sorrow in the room curdled into horror. Sheriff Rudd stood up. He could feel the tide turning. He could feel the noose of public opinion tightening. And he reacted with the desperation of a cornered animal. "This is a conspiracy," Rudd shouted, his face purple. "Look at them." He pointed a shaking finger at Jonah and Lark. "The killer and the whore. They are lovers. Anyone can see it. They cooked this up to ruin honest men. He is sleeping with her, and she is lying for him. Since when do we take the word of a self-confessed murderer over the law?" The room hummed with moral panic. Rudd had struck the nerve he knew was sensitive. In the Old West, romance outside of marriage was treated as proof of guilt. If they were lovers, their testimony was tainted. If they touched, they were conspiring. "Lies!" someone shouted from the back. "Hang the sheriff!" another voice screamed. The courtroom dissolved into chaos. The gavel banged uselessly like a heartbeat in a panic attack. Outside, the mob that had been gathering all morning surged against the doors. They were a mixture of angry fathers and hired thugs paid by Harlan. The glass of the front doors shattered. Inside, the tension snapped. "Get the ledger!" Rudd screamed to his deputies. Two men, loyal to Rudd and paid by Harlan, lunged toward the prosecutor's table where the black book lay. Marshal Davies drew his weapon. "Stand down! A shot fired!" It wasn't clear who pulled the trigger first, but the sound was deafening in the enclosed space. A chunk of plaster exploded from the ceiling. Women screamed and dove under the benches. Jonah moved. He didn't run for the exit. He ran for Lark. He grabbed her by the waist and dragged her down behind the heavy oak defense table, just as a second shot shattered the water pitcher on the judge's bench. "Stay down," Jonah commanded. He shielded her with his body, covering her head with his good hand. Lark was shaking, pressing her face into the dust of the floorboards. "Jonah!" she screamed. Jonah looked up over the edge of the table. The courtroom was a brawl. Davies and his men were wrestling with Rudd's deputies. The jury had scrambled out the side door, but Rudd wasn't fighting the deputies. He was walking toward them. He had his gun drawn, and his eyes were fixed on Lark. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to erase the witness. Jonah stood up. He had no weapon. His gun had been taken at the door. He had only his body and the sheer, immovable force of his will. He stepped out from behind the table, placing himself directly in Rudd's path. "Move, Kincaid." Rudd snarled. He raised the Colt .45. She dies today. Jonah didn't flinch. He didn't posture. He didn't raise his hands. He just looked at the man who had terrorized a county for a decade. "You don't get to own her," Jonah said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise of the brawl. It was a statement of fact, as solid as the mountains. "You can kill me," Jonah said, taking a step forward, "but you will never own a piece of her again." Rudd's hand shook. The breath rasped in his throat. He stared at Jonah, at the man who was willing to die for a woman the town called trash. For a second, the sheriff looked small. He looked like what he was, a bully stripped of his badge's power. "Drop it, Rudd." Marshal Davies was there. The barrel of his peacemaker pressed against Rudd's temple. Rudd froze. He looked at Jonah, then at Lark, who had risen to her knees behind the table. He spat on the floor. "It doesn't matter," Rudd hissed. "The town knows. They will never let her live clean. Kincaid, she is marked. It is a curse." Davies slammed the pistol against Rudd's head, sending the sheriff crumpled to the floor. "Cuff him!" Davies roared. Across the room, near the side exit, Silas Harlan was trying to slip away. He had abandoned his lawyers, abandoned his dignity. He was clawing at the door handle. Two of the marshal's deputies grabbed him. Harlan kicked and screamed, offering bribes, threatening ruin. "I am Silas Harlan. I own this town. Not anymore," one of the deputies grunted, dragging him back. But as they hauled him away, Jonah saw a man in the front row, a merchant, slip a card into Harlan's pocket. A lawyer nodded to him. The money was still working, even in chains. Harlan's power didn't die easily. The chaos settled into a heavy, smoking silence. The mob outside, hearing the shots, had pulled back, unsure if they wanted justice or just blood. Lark stood up. She brushed the dust from her dress. She looked at Rudd, bleeding on the floor. She didn't look triumphant. She looked tired. The verdict came 3 days later, after a new jury was impaneled and the atmosphere was locked down by federal troops. It was justice. But it was the justice of the West, partial, jagged, and bought at a discount. Sheriff Rudd was convicted of corruption, false imprisonment, and assault. He was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. Silas Harlan was convicted of trafficking and forced labor. But the charges of rape were dropped. The judge ruled there was insufficient evidence given the nature of his business. He was fined $10,000 and sentenced to 5 years. 5 years for a lifetime of stolen girls. Jonah stood in the back of the courtroom as the gavel fell. He felt the bitterness of it in his throat. Harlan would be out in 3 with good behavior. He would still be rich. But the ledger was public record now. The system had been exposed. Lark walked out of the courtroom, a free woman. The charges against her were dismissed with prejudice. The papers said she was vindicated. But as she walked down the aisle, the social punishment began. The stares were not apologetic. They were appraising. The whispers hissed like steam. "That's her, the one who lived in the house, the one Kincaid killed for." She wasn't a hero to them. She was a disruption. She was a mirror that showed them their own ugliness, and they hated her for it. A woman's freedom, she realized, was still conditional in their minds. She was free of the cell, but she was not free of the stigma. She pushed open the heavy double doors of the courthouse. The sunlight hit her like a physical blow. It was blindingly bright, reflecting off the melting snow and the puddles of mud. The air was cold and clean. Jonah was waiting for her at the bottom of the steps. He had his hat in his hand. His arm was still in the sling, and he looked older than he had when the winter began. He didn't smile. He just nodded. "It is done," he asked. "It is done," Lark said. She looked at the town. She saw the people watching from the boardwalks. She saw the hostility in the eyes of the shopkeepers who had done business with Harlan. "We can't stay here tonight," Jonah said. "There are men angry about the verdict. Harlan's friends." Lark looked at him. They had won, but the victory felt fragile. They were standing on the precipice of a new danger. Retaliation would come. Fences would be cut. Barns would burn. But she was standing in the sun. She took a deep breath. filling her lungs with air that didn't smell of whiskey or fear. "Let's go home," she said. Jonah put his hat on. He offered her his good arm. Lark took it. She didn't grip it for safety this time. She held it for partnership. They walked down the steps together. Two scarred people moving through a hostile world, alive, but not yet safe. The sunlight felt almost unreal, too bright for the darkness they had just left. But they walked into it anyway. The return to the high plains was a ride through a world that couldn't decide if it was dying or being born. The road from the county seat was a ribbon of drying mud, flanked by hills that were finally turning the electric green of early spring. But the beauty was scarred. Interspersed with the new grass were black, jagged patches where range fires had burned during the dry weeks of the trial. Green shoots pushed up through the char, a stubborn refusal to yield that mirrored the two people riding in the wagon. Jonah drove the team, his left arm still stiff in its sling, his eyes scanning the horizon not with the peace of a man coming home, but with the vigilance of a sentry. Lark sat beside him. She was no longer hiding under a bonnet. Her face was exposed to the wind and the sun, pale but set in a line of grim determination. They crested the final ridge and saw the ranch. It was still standing. That was the first mercy. But as they drew closer, the details resolved into a picture of malice. The corrals were empty. Dutch and Caleb had moved the herd to the upper range for safety, but the fences near the house gaped open like missing teeth. The wire had been cut, not just in one place, but between every post for a quarter of a mile. It was hours of work destroyed in minutes, a petty, labor-intensive vandalism meant to exhaust the spirit. Jonah pulled the wagon up to the barn. The smell of wet ash hung in the air. One side of the structure was blackened. Someone had piled brush against the logs and lit it, but the damp timber of spring had refused to catch fully, or perhaps Dutch had caught it in time. Jonah set the brake and climbed down. He walked to the main door of the house. Nailed to the wood, right at eye level, was a piece of rough crate slat. Scrawled on it in charcoal were 3 words: "We ain't done." Jonah reached out and ripped the wood from the door. He snapped it over his knee, the crack sounding like a pistol shot in the quiet yard. Lark had climbed down from the wagon. She stood looking at the blackened barn, then at the broken fence. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She looked at it with the weary recognition of someone who knew that monsters don't vanish just because a judge bangs a gavel. "It is a warning," Lark said. Her voice was flat. "It is cowardice," Jonah replied, tossing the broken wood into the mud. "They waited until we were gone." Dutch came out of the bunkhouse, carrying a Winchester. He looked older, his face lined with the stress of the last week. "Glad to see you, boss," Dutch said. "We saved the barn. Caleb is up with the cows. We lost 2 calves to the coyotes, but the rest are safe. You did good." "Dutch," Jonah said. Dutch looked at Lark, then touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Lark." Lark nodded. "Hello, Dutch." The greeting was simple, but the weight of it was immense. It was an acknowledgement of her place there. She wasn't the waif in the spare room anymore. She was the reason the fences were cut, and she was the reason the ranch was still standing. The reality of their victory settled in over the next week. It was a victory of paper, not of peace. The legal verdict had removed Sheriff Rudd and Silas Harlan, but it hadn't removed the hate they had cultivated. Prejudice in the West was not a weed you could pull out once. It was a root system that went deep into the bedrock. Jonah spent his days riding the perimeter, repairing the wire with one good hand and a lot of grit. His finances were bleeding out. The trial, the lawyer he had eventually hired to file the paperwork, the travel, the lost stock. It had drained the reserves he had built up over 10 years. One evening, sat at the kitchen table. Jonah stared at his ledger. The numbers were stark. He had enough money for seed and maybe a month of wages for the men. If the price of beef dropped, or if the summer was dry, they would be broken. Lark was washing dishes. She dried her hands and came to the table, pulling out the chair opposite him. "Tell me," she said. Jonah closed the book. "It is just ranch business, boring arithmetic." Don't, Lark said. She reached out and placed her hand on the leather cover of the book. You stood up in a courtroom and told the world you killed a man for me. She said, do not try to protect me from arithmetic. Jonah looked at her. He saw the steel in her spine. He sighed and opened the book. We are heavy on debt, Jonah admitted. The bank in Silverton is nervous because of the trial. They are threatening to call the note on the lower section. I am thinking of selling the south 40 acres. It has good water. It would clear the accounts. Lark looked at the numbers. She traced the columns with her finger. That is the best hay ground. She said, if you sell that, how do you feed the herd next winter? I buy hay. Jonah said. With what money? Lark asked. If you sell the land, you shrink the herd. If you shrink the herd, you make less money. It is a slow death. Jonah rubbed his face. Then what do you suggest? I cannot pay the men with good intentions. Lark looked at him. I have $300, she said. Jonah froze. What? In the lining of my coat. Lark said, When I left the house, I didn't just take the ledger. I took the cash box from the desk. It was money Harlan had just paid Rudd. Lark, Jonah said, his voice low. That is stolen money. It is my money, Lark said fiercely. It is back wages. It is payment for every bruise. It is the cost of the brand on my ankle. She stood up and went to the coat hanging by the door. She ripped the seam of the heavy wool and pulled out a stack of bills. She returned to the table and slammed them down on top of the ledger. Use it, she said. Pay the bank. Keep the land. Jonah stared at the money. It was dirty money. Blood money. But as he looked at Lark, he realized refusing it would be an insult. It would be treating her like a child who couldn't contribute to her own survival. He reached out and covered her hand with his. We will pay the bank, Jonah said, and we will keep the hay ground. But you are not a guest here. Lark, if you put this money in, you are a partner. You own a share of this herd's. Lark looked at him, her eyes shining. I am not an ornament. Jonah, I never want to be kept again. You aren't, Jonah said. You are the beam that holds up the roof. But strength in the daylight did not always translate to peace in the dark. The trauma of the last year, the years before that, did not vanish because the sheriff was in irons. It lived in Lark's body, a coiled spring waiting to snap. There were days when she was fine, laughing at Dutch's terrible coffee, working in the garden until her hands were brown with earth. And then there were the moments when the shadow fell. One afternoon, Jonah dropped a hammer on the porch. The loud, sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. Inside the kitchen, Lark didn't jump. She dropped to the floor. She curled into a ball under the table, her hands over her head, her breathing coming in short, strangled gasps. She wasn't in the kitchen anymore. She was back in the chaos of the courtroom, or worse, the back room of the saloon. Jonah came in, apologizing for the noise. He stopped when he saw her. He didn't rush to her. He didn't try to pull her up. He knew that grabbing a panicked animal only made it bite. He walked over and sat on the floor, 3 feet away from the table. He leaned his back against the cupboards and stretched his legs out. He picked up a piece of harness leather he had been mending and began to work it with his hands, making a rhythmic, scuffing sound. I am right here, Lark, Jonah said comfortably. The floor is pine. The stove is cold. The door is locked. He didn't look at her. He just continued to work the leather, letting his presence be a steady anchor in the storm of her mind. Lark stayed under the table for 10 minutes. Slowly, the gasping stopped. She uncurled. She looked at Jonah, shame flooding her face, the hot, prickly heat of feeling broken. I am sorry, she whispered. I am so stupid. It was just a hammer. Jonah looked up then. It is a loud hammer, he said. Scared me too. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her she was crazy. He just accepted her reality. Come out when you are ready, he said. I need someone to hold the buckle while I rivet this. Lark crawled out. She sat beside him on the floor. She took the buckle. Her hands were shaking, but she held it. And in that simple act of holding on, the shame began to recede, replaced by the quiet knowledge that she didn't have to be perfect to be safe. Their romance deepened in this soil. Not the frantic, desperate heat of the escape, but a slow-burning root system that went down deep. It was a love built on the understanding that they were both damaged, but that their broken pieces fit together to make something whole. It rained for 3 days straight in late April, trapping them inside. The house was cozy, smelling of wood smoke and the stew simmering on the stove. Jonah was reading by the fire. Lark was sitting on the rug, watching the flames. She looked at him, at the gray in his beard, the strong line of his jaw, the hands that could brand a calf or stitch a wound with equal skill. She felt a pull in her chest, a warmth that was not fear-based. It was want, pure, human want. She stood up and walked over to his chair. Jonah looked up, marking his place in the book with a finger. "Lark?" She didn't speak. She took the book from his hand and set it on the table. She sat on his lap. Jonah went still. He held his arms away, hovering, terrified of crossing a line she wasn't ready to cross. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice rough. Lark took his hands and placed them on her waist. "I am putting them here," she said. "I am choosing." She leaned in and kissed him. It was soft at first, a question. Jonah answered it with a gentle pressure. Then the heat flared. Lark deepened the kiss, her fingers tangling in his hair. She felt the power of his body beneath her, the potential for violence that he kept leashed for her sake. Suddenly, a memory spiked, a flash of a rough hand, a smell of whiskey. Lark pulled back, gasping, her body going rigid. Jonah stopped instantly. He didn't sigh. He didn't look frustrated. He just rested his forehead against hers. "Breathe," he whispered. "Just breathe. I have got you." Lark closed her eyes. She focused on his breathing. In, out. "Slow, steady," she reminded herself. "This is Jonah. This is safe." The panic crested and broke. She opened her eyes. "Don't stop," she whispered. "Are you sure?" Jonah asked, searching her face. "I am sure," Lark said. "I want to rewrite the memory. Jonah, I want to know that touch can be good." She guided his hand to her face, then down to her neck. She set the pace. She was the captain of the ship. And that night, in the quiet of the ranch house, Lark reclaimed her body. She learned that surrender wasn't about losing control. It was about trusting someone enough to let go. Later, lying in the dark, the rain drumming on the roof, Jonah spoke into the silence. "I am scared too, you know." Lark turned her head on the pillow. "You? The man who faced down a lynch mob?" That was anger. Jonah said, "This is terror." He pulled her closer. "I look at you, and I think about how easy it is to lose things in this world. A fever, a horse stumble, a bullet. I love you, Lark. And that means I have something to lose again. I don't know if I am strong enough to survive losing you." Lark reached out and touched his face in the dark. "Love isn't a shield." "Jonah," she said softly. "It won't stop the bullet. It won't stop the fever." "Then what is it?" Jonah asked. "It is a place to stand," Lark said. "It is the ground under your feet while you fight. We might lose each other. We might lose the ranch. But right now, we are here, and we are not alone. That has to be enough." Jonah kissed her palm. "It is enough," he said. May brought wildflowers and the necessity of a trip to town. The supplies were gone. They couldn't avoid it forever. They rode into Blackwater on a Tuesday. They didn't sneak in the back way. Jonah drove the wagon down Main Street, and Lark sat beside him, her head high. The town was unchanged, yet entirely different. The saloon was still there, but the back rooms were shuttered. Boarded up by order of the marshal, the mercantile was open. They walked into the store. The conversation died. The silence was heavy, filled with the echo of the trial. The clerk, a man who had once refused to look Lark in the eye, cleared his throat. "Mr. Kincaid? Miss Doyle? What can I get you?" It was civil. It was cold, but it was civil. As they were loading the sacks of flour, the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, walked by. She saw Lark and stiffened. She pulled her skirts tight and crossed the muddy street to avoid passing them. The judgment was still there. A slow rot that would take a generation to clear. But then Miss Albright, the school teacher, came out of the post office. She saw them and walked straight over, ignoring the mud on her hem. "Good morning, Lark," she said brightly. "Good morning, Miss Albright," Lark said, surprised. "I have a book for you. The teacher said, Jane Eyre. I thought you might like it. It is about a woman with a strong spirit." She handed the book to Lark. It was a public gesture, a seal of approval from one of the town's moral pillars. "Thank you," Lark said, her throat tight. As they were leaving, the Chinese laundress, Lynn, ran up to the wagon. She didn't speak, but she handed Lark a bundle wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a bolt of blue silk, the color of a summer sky. "For a new dress," Lynn said quietly. "Not gray, blue, for the singing bird." Lark clutched the silk. The tears she had held back in the courtroom threatened to spill. It wasn't forgiveness from the town. She didn't need their forgiveness, but it was community. It was the small, green shoots of change pushing through the char. But the West was not tamed yet. 2 weeks later, Jonah was miles away on the North Ridge, checking the herd. Lark was alone at the house, working in the vegetable garden. She was weeding the rows of early peas, the sun warm on her back. She didn't hear the horse. She only heard the boot on the soil behind her. She stood up and turned. Standing there was a man she recognized. It wasn't a deputy. It was one of the hired guns who had worked for Harlan, a man named Silas. He had escaped the marshal's net. He looked ragged, his eyes red-rimmed with whiskey and hate. He held a knife, a long Bowie blade that glinted in the sun. "Mister, Harlan sends his regards." The man rasped. "He says you owe him 5 years." Lark froze. It was the instinctual freeze of the prey. Her mind went white. The garden, the sun, the peas, it all dissolved into the point of that knife. The man stepped closer, grinning. "Not so loud now, are you? No judge here, no cowboy to hide behind." He lunged. The movement broke the spell. Lark didn't scream. She didn't faint. She threw herself backward, tripping over a mound of earth. The knife slashed the air where her throat had been. She scrambled on her hands and knees, dirt flying. She wasn't a hero in a dime novel. She was a terrified woman fighting for air. She reached the tool shed door, but he was too fast. He grabbed her braid and yanked her back. Lark cried out, her head snapping back. "Got you," he hissed. Lark's hand flailed, searching the ground. Her fingers closed around the handle of the garden hoe she had dropped. She didn't think about mercy. She didn't think about justice. She swung the hoe with every ounce of strength she possessed. The heavy iron blade struck the man in the shin. Bone cracked. He howled and let go of her hair. Lark rolled away, scrambling to her feet. She didn't run to the house. She ran to the open space of the yard where she could move. The man limped after her, cursing, the knife still in his hand. "You little witch! I will cut you open!" Lark backed up, holding the hoe like a staff. She was shaking, her breath coming in sobs, but she kept the weapon between them. "Stay back!" she screamed. He laughed, a wet, ugly sound, and charged. A rifle shot cracked the air. The man spun around, clutching his shoulder, the knife flying from his hand. He fell into the dust, writhing. Jonah rode into the yard, Miller's hooves tearing up the ground. He didn't wait for the horse to stop. He vaulted from the saddle, the rifle still smoking in his hand. He reached the man in 2 strides. He kicked the knife away. He put the barrel of the rifle against the man's forehead. Jonah's face was a mask of cold, white fury. His finger tightened on the trigger. He wanted to end it. He wanted to wipe the threat from the earth. "Jonah? No!" Lark's voice cut through the red haze. Jonah looked up. Lark was standing there, covered in garden dirt, her chest heaving. "Don't kill him," she said. "Not like this. We are not them." Jonah looked at the man, then at Lark. He slowly lowered the rifle. He stepped back, breathing hard. He tied the man's hands and threw him over his horse. "I am taking him to the marshal," Jonah said. Lark nodded. She dropped the hoe. Her legs gave out, and she sat down hard in the dirt. Jonah went to her then, pulling her into his arms, rocking her while the adrenaline shook out of her body. It wasn't a glorious victory. It was ugly. It was violent. But she had survived. That night, after the man was handed over to the law, Jonah and Lark sat on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the plains in shades of violet and gold. "We can't just be ranchers," Jonah said. Lark looked at him. "What do you mean?" "This place," Jonah said, gesturing to the valley. "It is safe now, but there are other girls. Lynn told me about a cousin in Denver, another debt contract. We can bring her here," Lark said instantly. Jonah nodded. "We need hands for the harvest. We can offer work, real work, with wages, a place to heal." They decided then, the Kincaid Ranch would become a sanctuary, not a charity, but a fortress, a place where the rules of the West, that strong men take what they want, did not apply. The closing arc of their story was quiet. A month later, Lark sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen. She wrote a letter to the bank, authorizing the payment for the hay ground. At the bottom, she signed her name. She didn't write Lark. She wrote Clara Doyle. Her hand didn't shake. The name looked strong on the paper. It was the name she was born with, the name she had lost, and the name she had found again. Outside, Jonah was repairing the last section of the fence. He stretched the wire tight, the metal singing in the wind. He hammered the staple home. It was solid. It would hold. He walked back to the house. Lark met him on the porch. She was holding a small sapling, a cottonwood. "For the yard?" she said. "It needs shade." Jonah took the shovel. They dug the hole together. The ground was hard, but they broke through it. They planted the tree, packing the earth down around the roots. They stood back and looked at it. It was a fragile thing against the vastness of the plains. A drought might come. A storm might snap it, but it might grow. Jonah put his arm around Lark's waist. She leaned into him, her head on his shoulder. The wind blew across the grass, wild and free. The future was not written. The cattle prices might fall. The winter might be hard. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land they had fought for, Jonah and Lark stood together. They had chosen each other, not as a scandal, not as a necessity, but as a life. "Ready?" Jonah asked. "Ready," Clara said. They turned and walked into the house, closing the door against the night, leaving the light in the window burning for anyone who might be lost in the dark. Thank you for listening. To every reader who has traveled this long, dusty road with Jonah and Lark, thank you. Stories of the American West are often about conquest and violence, but I hope this story reminded you that the bravest thing a person can do in a hard world is simply to remain soft enough to love. I would love to hear your thoughts. Where are you listening from? Did Lark's journey resonate with you? Please leave a comment below in English and share your feelings. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of grit, romance, and the raw beauty of the frontier, please subscribe to From Wild West. There are many more stories waiting to be told around the campfire. Until next time, keep your fences mended and your powder dry.